Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk a little bit about the history of WCW. I want to do this new thing where I talk about like a different wrestling promotion each and every day uh, on this channel. So if you're into that, continue to watch. But let's get into it. What is WCW or the NWA? Let's get into the NWA first. The NWA was a wrestling. It was not a wrestling promotion in and of itself, not a wrestling promotion per se. It was a conglomerate. What happened was we talked about in the last video the beginnings of professional wrestling. What it was when it started. That it was initially a legitimate sport, much like mixed martial arts is today. But over time, through the manipulation of promoters, it became worked. It was originally catch wrestling. Well, like I said in that video, the main purpose of it becoming worked was the promoters wanting power, the promoters wanting to consolidate power and wealth in their own hands. And they needed to do that because if they didn't, the business would have not became what the business inevitably became. And by the 1940s, like I said, in the 1930s, in 1930, the original NWA formed, the National Wrestling Association. But that really wasn't a promotion. That was more like a governing body of different promoters. Like the same thing with the National Wrestling Alliance, which was formed later in 1948. But the difference here was this was sort of like it was modeled on the National Boxing Association, the boxing version. But that quickly fell apart because at that time you had promoters who like Harry Landry that wanted to maintain the legitimacy of wrestling and others that wanted to go in the more work direction with the likes of Jim Londos when they put the belt on him in 1932. So that quickly split up. That lasted until 1949. What happened in 1948 with the NWA? Not everybody recognized the National Wrestling Association Championship. So, being as that was the case, there were different world champions all around the country. In different areas. Every promoter had their area. So these promoters decided to all come together one day in Waterloo, Iowa, in 1948, and form the new NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. And what it was like it was similar to how the U.S. Congress was, how the First Continental Congress was. Each promoter would represent his or her, well, his, there was only men at that time, his promotion, and they would agree on a champion. And when they agreed on this champion, each promoter would get bookings with that champion. So the champion would have to be a traveling champion. He would have to be able to go around to various different territories, initially just the United States, but later expanded across North America to Canada and Mexico and across overseas to Japan when professional wrestling became popular in those areas. So, and it was, and the president was the St. Louis promoter Sam Mushnick, and this worked for many years until 1960. By 1956, the the national, I mean, the federal government came after the National Wrestling Alliance because they figured, hey, wait a minute, this is a monopoly. These promoters, although they're pretending to act separately, and they do have their own separate interests, like they each have a local title. Like in Memphis, for example, in the CWA, they had, the Southern Heavyweight Champion. Other places they had U.S. champions, TV champions, whatever. Especially those that had television when television became a factor. And monopolies are a very dangerous thing in the United States, have been ever since the Industrial Revolution. So the United States did not want that. So they came after the NWA, but Sam Mushnick was, a powerful local promoter. He was able to weasel out of that. But they came up with the idea that it would be best for them if one of those promoters split off. And Vern Gagne was already unhappy with the NWA because they just didn't want to put the belt on. They just didn't want to put the belt on him, despite him being the most popular wrestler in the Chicago area. And NWA TV was based. It was wrestling out of the Marigold Arena on the Dumont Network in Chicago, right? And the promoter of the Chicago territory was Freddie Kohler. So Vern had challenged the NWA champion Lou Thesz 3 times, and both times he didn't want to drop it to him. So Vern decides to buy Tony Stecker's territory, the Minneapolis. Tony Stecker had been promoting wrestling since before the NWA existed, since 1930 as the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club in Minnesota. So Vern decides he's one of the main stars there. That's Vern's hometown, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Vern decides to buy the territory. And Vern decides to leave the NWA and form the AWA in 1960. The NWA champion at this time is Pat O'Connor, a wrestler from New Zealand. Vern Gagne gives Pat O'Connor 90 days to answer Vern's challenge. And if the challenge is not answered, Vern is the new champion. So the challenge, needless to say, is not answered. And Vern goes off and forms the AWA. Okay, and then in 1963, there is yet another disagreement. The promoters in the NWA want to take the title off of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers and put it back on Lou Thesz, who was a mainstay in the St. Louis area where the promotion is based. Because another successful TV show, especially by the time we get to the 1960s, Dumont era is over. So now wrestling in the Marigold Arena is no longer as popular as it was in the late 40s and early 50s. By the 60s, St. Louis is the hot spot for wrestling, and the television show is Wrestling at the Chase Hotel in St. Louis, Missouri. And Lou Thesz is the man there. So Mushnick wants to put the belt back on him, but Vince McMahon Sr., the promoter in New York City, doesn't want that. You know what I mean? So he also breaks away from the NWA. He and his partner Toots Mondt forming the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in 1963. But everybody else stays. All the other promoters around the country and around the world stay. And basically, it exists with these main 3 promotions. The AWA based out of Minneapolis, and they gobble up other territories like the Dakotas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and by 1981 also San Francisco, because the original promoter of NWA San Francisco, Roy Shire, is bought out by Vern Gagne. So mostly the West is AWA, most of the East is WWF, and most of the South is the National Wrestling Alliance. Now, there are certain instances where other promoters, particularly in LA in the 50s, do leave the NWA too, because they have issues with the way the organization is running. The Los Angeles territory broke away the Los Angeles territory broke away in 1961, but rejoined the NWA, and they were when they were independent, they were called the Worldwide Wrestling Association, the WWA. But they rejoined the National Wrestling because they had their champion who was popular in LA, Edward Carpentier, and they didn't want to take the belt off him. So they went on their own independently also. But they rejoined in 1968. So basically, Southern California, the Southeast, and everywhere else that wasn't owned by Vern Gagne or Vince McMahon was the NWA. And the NWA champion traveled around these other territories. In the 60s, it was Gene Kaninsky. In the 70s, most of the 70s, it was Harley Race, then Terry Funk, then Dusty Rhodes, and then Ric Flair wins it for the first time in 1981 from Dusty Rhodes. No, by this time, by 1981, Vince McMahon Sr. has rejoined. He also rejoined the NWA. He decided that his partner Toots Mount was no longer in the WWF, so he decided for the best thing for him to do, even though he maintained some autonomy, and in the magazines and stuff, they still called his champions like Pedro Morales, Stan Stasiak, Bruno, superstar Billy Graham, for example. They still called them world champions. He secretly reconciled with the NWA, and he was back on the board. So Vince McMahon became the deciding vote to have Ric Flair hold the the NWA championship for the first time, be defeating Dusty Rhodes in '81. But by 1983, his son has bought him out. He bought him out the year before in 1982. So he bought out his other partners, the partners he put on after Toots Monts, which were Gorilla Monsoon, Arnold Scullin, Willie Gilzenberg, and Phil Zacco. These guys were bought out by Vince McMahon Jr. And Vince McMahon Jr. didn't want to be in the NWA. He says, "The hell with the NWA! I'm going to take all these guys over. I'm going to compete with them." By 1982, in addition to buying his father's promotion, the Los Angeles promotion had gone bankrupt. I failed to mention in the MMA video about this individual. He was the promoter out of Los Angeles. He and his brother, Judo Gene LaBelle. He was a judo expert and a legitimate shooter. And he was very influential in mixed martial arts as well because, of course, judo was his first discipline before professional wrestling. And he actually defeated, supposedly, and this is covered in the movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Oliver Stone. Supposedly, Judo Gene LaBelle had a confrontation with Bruce Lee, the martial arts movie expert from Hong Kong, what they call Hong Kong street fighting. And according to Dana White, the father of mixed martial arts because of the invention of his discipline, Jeet Kune Do, which is a combination of strikes, submissions, and hits, kicks, and submissions. So it's kind of is similar to what is modern day mixed martial arts. But anyway, Judo Gene LaBelle decides to sell the territory to Vince McMahon Jr. So the Los Angeles territory, which was once a thriving territory, especially in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, is part of the WWF now. And then gradually they all fall away, each and every one of them, including the original founder of WCW, the boss of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about an individual that was actually in the cabinet of President Jimmy Carter, the 39th president of the United States. This man is Jim Barnett. Jim Barnett enters the business as an understudy of Fred Kohler and eventually climbs up the ranks, becoming a part-time owner of the Indianapolis territory with Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder, and a part-time owner of the Detroit territory with the original Sheik. But by 1964, he was gay, by the way. By 1964, his lifestyle's discovered, and he decides to sell his portion of the Indianapolis territory, which is an NWA territory, the Detroit territory, which also is an NWA territory, and he goes to Australia. And it's in Australia that he first comes up with the name World Championship Wrestling. Yes, World Championship Wrestling. And he promotes cards in Australia up until 1972. By 1972, they need him back in the United States because Ray Gunkel, the promoter and owner of the Georgia territory, Georgia Championship Wrestling. Now, he wasn't the founder. The founder, founding it in the 1950s, he went by the name Jerry, gentleman by the name of Jerry Oates, and another gentleman by the name of Paul Jones. They were the original founders, but by 1972, Ray Gunkel was the owner. He dies in the ring. So he suffers a severe heart attack in the ring, and he dies. So now people say his wife, Ann Gunkel, is going to take over, but other people want to swoop in. So there's a power struggle. She breaks away. She forms her breakaway faction, All South Wrestling. Now, recently, around this time, the early 70s, Ted Turner has gotten into the wrestling business, basically, in a way. Kind of, he has gotten into the cable business. He basically expanded his father's cable business, and he's featuring, local stuff. Andy Griffith Show, Braves Baseball, and professional wrestling, the Georgia Championship Wrestling on his channel. And there was supposedly rumors that he was having an affair with Ray Gunkel's wife, Ann. So he supports her in the power struggle, not the other NWA bosses. And she breaks away and she forms All South Wrestling. But these other bosses, they want her out. And the other bosses are people that bought into the territory, such as Ole Anderson, who was one of the main stars, or the Briscoe brothers. Because the Briscoe brothers bought the territory from Bobby Shane. In the early 1970s, there was a plane crash in Florida, and Bobby Shane was killed. And once the Briscoe brothers found this out, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, they bought into the territory. And all these other promoters, they want her out. So they call different bookers. They call Bill Watts, who's an up-and-coming booker in the Tulsa territory, Leroy McGurk's territory. They call Jerry Jarrett, who also is an up-and-coming booker, to book for this territory. And they even call Jim Barnett. Ultimately, Georgia Championship Wrestling wins the day. And Jim Barnett wins the day as well. And they have national cable overlay on TBS, right? So Jim Barnett wants to expand to Canton, Ohio, Akron, Ohio, even Cleveland, right? These places are basically dead. But he used to promote these places with his partner in the 60s, Johnny Doyle. So he is very familiar with these territories. Even Vince McMahon Sr., who is close with the promoter from upstate New York, Pedro Martinez, he doesn't even want to promote these territories, right? Because this territory is basically, the Cleveland territory, basically dead. All of Ohio is basically dead. All of Detroit is basically dead. But Georgia is trying to resurrect it. They're bringing it back, right, through their cable TV, and their TV is showing there, and they are actually, through the TV, even though they're based in Georgia, they're actually drawing crowds in places in Michigan and Ohio. And this was, during the feud of Dusty Rhodes and Ole Anderson. Every NWA wrestler is coming to Georgia because of the TBS TV. But fast forward to 1984, and now Vince McMahon is looking to expand to Georgia. He's already on the USA Network yeah, because Tully Blanchard's father's promotion, Joe Blanchard, they were Southwest Championship Wrestling, based out of San Antonio, Texas. They were kicked off. They were kicked off because somebody was throwing feces. One wrestler was throwing feces at another wrestler, and they're like, no, we're not having that on our network. So Vince he was at one time he was on HBO in the early days. Now now he's picked up by USA Network. So he's already on basic cable. So he figures, hey, I'll expand my market to Georgia, a more established territory, and I'll have two cable networks. I'll have USA Network and I'll have WTBS. So he tries to do that. And he buys out the Briscoes. He buys out, Jim Barnett. Him and Jim Barnett leave. They both leave the NWA at the same time in '83, right? And they figure, hey, I'll make a run for it. Well, he doesn't. He appears on their Saturday night show, their main show. And he makes a deal with Ted Turner. And Ted Turner is fine with it. But the problem is, he's fine with him being on both USA Network and WTBS. This is 1984. Problem is, the fans aren't okay with it. They're used to seeing Gordon Soley. They're used to seeing these Southern wrestlers, Mr. Wrestling 2, all these Georgia-based wrestlers. They're like, hey, what is this New York bullshit? That we're seeing on our TV screen. Vince McMahon, get out of here. We don't want to see Vince McMahon. We don't want to see Hulk Hogan. We don't want to see these Iron Sheik, right? They try to appeal to them by having, the likes of Dick Murdoch, who was a legend in the South, right? But still not working. There's this surreal episode where Gorilla Monsoon is interviewing Tito Santana and the JYD right before a big show, and it's like, wow, seeing Gorilla Monsoon standing there on that WCW Saturday Night set was just surreal to see. But eventually, ratings decline, and Ted Turner is calling Bill Watts. He's calling Bill Watts back. He's like, hey, Bill, why don't you bring your style of wrestling, from based out of Louisiana, Mid-South wrestling to here to Georgia, and he's calling Ole Anderson back, and Ole Anderson has his show. So they're basically three wrestling shows: Vince's show, on Ole Anderson's show, and Bill Watts' show. And Bill Watts' show is getting the biggest ratings because back then in the early '80s, when before JYD left, and immediately right after he left, Bill Watts was still on fire. The early '80s, 79 to about 85. Louisiana had the best wrestling in the country. But Vince doesn't like this. He's like, hey, we had a deal, to Turner. So they had a deal. And he's like, fuck it, I'll sell the Georgia slot. And he does. He sells the Georgia slot to a promoter in North Carolina named Jim Crockett Jr., who had just recently taken over for his dad. Because Black Saturday was such a disaster. And they pay him $1 million. And the $1 million, and Vince tells him, listen, you will choke on that $1 million. He tells Jim Crockett. And Crockett, buys the territory. And what Crockett does is he hires Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes, big star from 1975 when he turned babyface in Florida. And he learned his booking credentials from Eddie Graham. He sat at the foot of Eddie Graham, the promoter in Florida, right? Southern Florida, from Tampa on down. Tampa, Fort Lauderdale, Miami. He sat at the foot of this guy. with all the other promoters considered to be the guru of um, of wrestling. So Dusty was ready to go on his own. So he leaves Eddie Graham's territory, and unfortunately for Eddie Graham, uh, that would lead to his personal destruction and inevitably his unaliving himself. I can't use the S word, but um he basically he took his own life. You know what I mean? Because he lost his business. You know what I mean? Because Dusty left, and not only that, now Dusty's gone to the Carolinas, and he's taking all his stars. He's training them. You know what I mean? Ron Simmons, Lex Luger, and all these guys, but he can't train them fast enough. As soon as he trains them up, Dusty takes them. So by 1987, the Florida territory is sold to Jim Crockett, because now Jim Crockett is becoming, after he buys the Georgia territory from Vince in '84, he's becoming like the Southern Vince. You know what I mean? Like he's buying up all the Southern territories now. He buys Florida in '87. He buys the Bob Geigel and Harley Race's territory in '85. The Central States, based out of Kansas City, Missouri. So he's buying up everybody. He's becoming a little daimyo, basically. And what about Bill Watts? Bill Watts, he's lost to JYD. JYD went to New York in '84 without telling Bill. Just without telling Bill, just skippity doodad to New York, left New Orleans. The big fan base that he had in New Orleans, the New Orleans Civic Center, the Dog's House, the Superdome, New Orleans Superdome, where Dog used to pack him out with matches against Kamala, matches against Butch Reed, matches against the Freebirds originally when he came there from Calgary in '79. Now he's no longer there, right? And Bill Watts depended on him because the territories that Watts ran, like in Mississippi, in Houston, and especially in New Orleans, with the large black population, they needed a black superstar. That's what brought them to the dance. When Bill Watts took over from Leroy McGuirk in the late '70s, Bill changed the complexion, literally, of the stars there. Leroy McGuirk, he had the territory based out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was pushing, Danny Hodge and Dick Murdoch and the grappler Lynn Denton. These white stars. And Bill Watts was like, no, we got Bill Watts had been in WWE in the 1960s, and he saw how over Bobo Brazil was. He was like, we could do that, but on a larger scale with a black superstar. This is what we got to get. We got to get a black guy. You know what I mean? And with his booker, the first African-American booker ever in wrestling history, Ernie Ladd, that's what they do. They create the JYD, and the JYD is the phenomenon. But now JYD has left, and they can't build up new stars because they keep leaving too. They keep either going to the two big behemoths of Jim Crockett and Vince McMahon. So, and then an oil recession hits. The late '80s, an oil recession hits. There is another issue in Israel. There's the first Intifada, the uprisings in the territories that Israel had acquired in 1967 in the Six-Day War. Those Palestinians there, the West Bank and Gaza, they've now revolted. And this is a domino effect in the Middle East. And this domino effect in the Middle East of an oil recession, just like it was in '73 during the Yom Kippur War, it has an effect on the territories that Watts is running, especially Oklahoma and Texas, right, with this oil recession. Now, oil is the business that they depend on in Oklahoma and Texas, the places where Watts runs. He can no longer he can no longer draw from those businesses. He tries to expand. He rebrands Mid South Wrestling to the UWF, the Universal Wrestling Federation, because all the promoters in the United States are going national. So he decides, hey, I'm going to go national too, right, with Jim Ross by his side. But because of this oil recession and because of what's going on in the Middle East between uh, Israel and Palestine, and how it's affecting, uh, business, he can't. Yeah, he can no longer do it. He can't do it. It's impossible. So he goes. He has one or two choices. He could sell to Vince or he could sell to Crockett, and he sells to Crockett. And from there, Dusty Rhodes is doing really well since he's left Florida. He's going to Crockett. He changed Ric Flair to a heel. He built the Four Horsemen. He brought in the Rock and Roll Express from Mid South, the Midnight Express. Crockett is a number one competitor for Vince. Different pay-per-views. They did Starrcade 83 in 83, but by the time Dusty gets there in 84, 85, they're doing the Great American Bashes, they're doing War Games, they're doing everything different. And it's good up until 1987. What happens in 87? Well, they decide to expand. They want to go national too, and they expand to Uniondale, New York, Vince's territory, Long Island. Nassau Coliseum, the Bunkhouse Stampede. It sucks. Nobody likes it. Nobody likes it because even though they could have saw them on TBS, Crockett's territory, they don't feel like it was lucrative enough. So by 1988, Crockett is bankrupt. What's he going to do now? He has to sell too. So is he going to sell to Vince McMahon and he'll have a repeat of Black Saturday with Vince owning WCW, or is he going to sell to, who's he going to sell to? And he ends up selling to Ted Turner. And by here we get to the next part of the video, and that is the Turner years. Ted Turner is a media mogul. He doesn't want to get rid of professional wrestling because professional wrestling is lucrative. But Crockett just priced himself out. Crockett, his main partner, has priced himself out. He bought Bill Watts' territory. He moved the headquarters of his promotion from Charlotte to Dallas, Texas, trying to be the Vince McMahon of the South. He's ended up going bankrupt. He went to Chicago, and he was successful in Chicago, believe it or not, with the Road Warriors coming over to him in '86. Right, he was very successful in Chicago, but he wouldn't put the belts on them. Dusty Rhodes kept doing Dusty finishes and fucking the baby faces out of their chance to beat Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. So by the end of 1988, Ted Turner buys the promotion, but Ted Turner doesn't know how to run it. So he hires this guy named Jim Hurd, so a guy who used to work for Sam Muchnick in St. Louis, right? Doesn't really know anything about professional wrestling, wants to turn Ric Flair, the star of the promotion, into Spartacus, put an earring in his ear, and he wants ding-dongs, and he wants wrestling hunchbacks. Bullshit. You know what I mean? And they get rid of Dusty Rhodes eventually by 1989, and they hire George Scott. George Scott used to be the booker for Jim Crockett Promotions before 1984, like in the 70s, when they bought, when they were known as Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. He's basically responsible for the creation of Ric Flair, for the creation of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. He pushed heavily Wahoo McDaniel in the Carolinas. He was setting the territory on fire in the 1970s, so they figured he could do the same thing in 1989. Nope, he fails to. He brings Ricky Steamboat back from WWE, but he fails to promote the Ricky Steamboat Ric Flair match at Clash of Champions, going head to head with WrestleMania 5. So he has to go. They fire him, right? And then by 1990. They hire Ole Anderson. They figure, hey, Ole Anderson had success, in Georgia Championship Wrestling. He booked himself and Dusty Rhodes the turn at the Omni, one of the greatest turns in wrestling history. He could do it again 10 years later. If he did it in 80, he could do it in 90. Nope, he doesn't work out either. He books a terrible storyline between him and Sting. Who is Sting? Sting is the new babyface that they built up. Uh, because Vince McMahon basically sabotaged them in 1987 when they went to Long Island, uh, they had a pay-per-view that was a battle royal. So Vince McMahon put on a battle royal, the first Royal Rumble in 1988. Vince McMahon convinces USA Network, hey, put this event on free TV. It comes from Hamilton, Ontario. So there's the Jim Crockett Battle Royal, the Bunkhouse Stampede, and the first Royal Rumble in 1988. And who do you think wins? Of course, the free one wins. So they're doing Starrcade 87, right? The plan is to have Ric Flair, who's the NWA champion, go against Ronnie Garvin. It was supposed to be Magnum TA, but Magnum TA gets injured. So they put the belt on Ronnie Garvin, and it's him and Ric Flair and Ronnie Garvin in Starrcade 87. Vince decides he's going to tell the cable companies, say, if you carry this, you won't be able to carry WrestleMania 4. So most cable companies outside of the Carolinas don't carry Jim Crockett's pay-per-view. So he two blows to him. He aired a free special that got bigger ratings than a pay-per-view, and he killed that pay-per-view. He also basically convinced the cable companies to not air their biggest event, Starrcade 87. So how does Crockett counter? Crockett counters by counter-programming Clash of Champions 1 with WrestleMania 4. And of course, just like with Royal Rumble 88 and Bunkhouse Stampede, the free one is more successful. And here they showcase Sting. The first, one of the acquisitions that comes over from Bill Watts is UWF. And he becomes the main nemesis of Ric Flair throughout the 1980s and 90s. So they decide to do the same thing again with WrestleMania 5 in 89. But this time, George Scott is in charge, and George Scott does not promote the thing because he believes that wrestling is still a house show business and that wrestling should depend on the house show cards and not the television cards, and that they're giving away one of their best matches, Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat, for free. So his dumb ass, the rematch in New Orleans, he does not promote that. So he's quickly let go. And they bring in, like I said, Ole Anderson by 1990. And Ole Anderson's bright idea is to have a mysterious figure, supposedly played by Al Perez, called the Black Scorpion, chasing Sting around for the whole year. But Al Perez, needless to say, the Latin lover, he's no longer the Black Scorpion, and the Black Scorpion ends up being Ric Flair. And that's the main event for Starrcade 1990. When we go into 1991, Dusty Rhodes comes back. Dusty Rhodes was in the WWF from 89 to 91. I'm not really going to go into what was his storylines, particularly with the Macho Man and Ted DiBiase. That's for another video. But he comes back, and he brings back War Games, and he brings back all the things that he wanted to do. He invents this concept Battle Bowl, which Sting wins the first one. Great Muta wins the second one, becoming the NWA champion. But his second run is not really as successful as his first run, so they bring back Bill Watts. Bill Watts had been out of the business since UWF closed. He still had a lot of the same ideas. WCW had going in different directions. Wrestling itself had going in different directions, but especially WCW, the more light heavyweight divisions. But he feels like, he said, oh, fuck it. Kip Allen Fry, who was the boss. Not Dusty was the booker, but Kip Allen Fry was the boss. He was overpaying a lot of these guys. He felt he was overpaying the likes of Brian Pillman, the likes of Paulie Dangerously, these performers. And Bill Watts just wasn't having it. Bill Watts was his idea was to cut the budget and to make moves off the top rope illegal to get the heels more heat and to put the belt on Ron Simmons, making Ron Simmons in 1992, making Ron Simmons the first black champion of a national promotion by defeating Vader. Uh, Jeff Hardy or RVD. Uh, I like Jeff Hardy. So, but Watts' time in WCW is terrible. The history of WCW. Uh, he was never in WCW, but Jeff Hardy is a native of the Carolinas, the territory where WCW started. Basically, or was the headquarters of WCW in the 1980s. You know, but basically, Watts' time there is terrible. He makes some racist comments or gets caught saying racist shit. Mark Madden snitches on him. He's out of there, and Eric Bischoff is in. Eric Bischoff was in the AWA, but the AWA shut down. He tried to work for Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon didn't like him, so he came to WCW initially as an announcer, but they needed an executive producer, and they got him for the job. He's the one that turns WCW around. By 1994, he gets the services of Hulk Hogan. He gets the services of Macho Man by the end of 1994. And by 1995, he's going head to head with Vince McMahon, flagship show, Monday Night Raw. Uh, well, I put it in two different periods. I put it in, okay, the NWA period, I'll say, is Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, Sting, and Ricky Steamboat. And the WCW period, which I date from Bischoff's period onward, is Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, Sting, again Sting, but this is Crow Sting. From Crow Sting is the Bischoff era, Surfer Sting is the NWA era. I dated from 1996 onward. That's Sting and Lex Luger. A lot of people will put Goldberg on that Nitro era, but I mean, he was dominant from 1998 onward. You know what I mean? But his reign was so short because let's be honest, guys, Goldberg loses. We're jumping ahead, but Goldberg loses in 1998 to Kevin Nash, and he's never able to regain his great status in WCW. Other people during the Russo era, Russo comes in 1999, October of 1999. Other people were pushed in WCW ahead of Bill Goldberg. Booker T becomes a star during the Russo era, especially after Bash at the Beach 2000. Scott Steiner becomes big. Russo's big idea to revitalize Goldberg was to turn him heel, to have him join the faction, the New Blood, and that was shit. You know? So Goldberg, if WCW had existed had survived and had not been bought out by Vince McMahon in 2001, maybe Goldberg would have been on the WCW Mount Rushmore, but he just cannot be. You know what I mean? He cannot be, in my opinion, because he had a huge impact, but his impact was short. You know? And basically, Basically, he was put in that position too, guys, because they had nobody else. You know what I mean? Brian Looper, yes, the Giants. Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore is only four. I couldn't include him. The Giant definitely, especially in 1997, the Giant was the most over babyface in the whole company. That was wrestling because Sting was not wrestling. Remember, Sting was out from September of '96 to December December of '97 as a wrestler. He would only appear in the Raptors and show up to beat up the NWO. He didn't have any matches. So the Giant was the most over. So yeah, if Mount Rushmore had more than four slots, I definitely will put the Giant in there. It's funny because Dave Meltzer talks about how when Paul White, the Giant, was in WCW, Vince McMahon would talk about, man, they don't know how to book a Giant. If I were to get my hands on him, you know, I'd make a star out of him like my dad did Andre. Well, when he did get his hands on him in '99, the Giant slash Big Show was a jobber in WWE. Basically, he was never a star. He held the world title for a couple of times. You know what I mean? But his reigns were never long. He was a bigger star in WCW. It turns out that WCW, especially like I said in '97, used him better than Vince ever did. And he was a homegrown talent. He never had been anywhere else. He broke into the business in '95 in WCW. You know, and the guy was world champion after his first match against Hulk Hogan. Yes, it was a hokey angle, Halloween Havoc '95, with him falling off the arena in Cobo Hall and then coming back. Right. Anthony is absolutely correct. I agree with Anthony. Vince didn't really make rock stars with Giants. Kane could have been a bigger star. Big Show felt mid, and Undertaker really built himself. Yes, because if you look at Taker, right? Taker was from 1990. Taker started in 1990. From 1990 to about 1997, yes, Taker had the main event feud a year after he was there with Hogan, but he really wasn't a star. He was facing the likes of Giant Gonzalez, a washed-up King Kong Bundy in '95. He was he was he was just a background player by comparison to guys like Brett and guys like Shawn Michaels and guys like Diesel. You know, it wasn't until 1997 onward that he became a star. And Kane, and I agree with Anthony, they dropped the ball with Kane immediately because Kane comes in October of '97, wins the title in June of 1998 in the first blood match with Austin, and immediately loses the belt the next night on Raw to Austin. So Kane's first title reign was basically wasted. What could have been a main event program between him and Austin built up to a WrestleMania was wasted on a first blood match at King of the Ring that was overshadowed by the Foley Undertaker match, because that's the match from King of the Ring '98 that everybody talks about. And in a title reign that lasted a day, yeah. But he could have still done that, Brian, by building Kane up, having Kane be undefeated, having Kane be a monster, and having a blow off at WrestleMania. I mean, yeah, in hindsight, it worked because we got the feud with Austin and Rock, and that was the stuff of magic. But still, it didn't do Kane any favors. I guess he felt like guys like Taker and Kane, their gimmick was strong enough to bounce back from stuff like that. But after a while, Kane's gimmick wasn't strong enough. You know what I mean? By the time we get to Kane losing his mask, Kane had lost his luster. And WWE does this with every big man. Either the big man or the foreigners, they're menacing for a while. Then after a while, they become. Yeah, that's a good idea, Anthony. You're right. I agree with that. Anthony says they should have sourced out the talent outside when the big guys were coming, invested with these guys had their own super division. The way guys like Kane would not lose their substance. Exactly. That was the part that was different. And guys like Kane and guys like Big Show, like you can't compare him to Andre the Giant because when Andre the Giant was on top as a babyface in the 70s, there was different territory. So he was never in even though Vince McMahon Sr. was his promoter, he was never in WWF or WWF, that New York territory for all that long. He went all over to everywhere. That's how he became one of the first big national stars of wrestling. They would see him everywhere. They would see him in AWA. They would see him here, see him there. You know what I mean? Vince McMahon would loan him out. Vince Sr., the father, would loan him out to other promoters. Vince Jr. wouldn't do that. He had the guys under exclusive contract. So, of course, seeing them every week on TV is going to get stale. you know, seeing them seeing them get beat by the babyface is going to get stale because they're going to lose their luster, which they eventually did. An all giant division would have been cool, you know what I mean? But and I'm surprised they didn't build up Austin and Big Show to a big program, man. You know what I mean? Like you would have thought that the way Austin was over and the way Big Show was, that Austin and Big Show would have been the Attitude Era's the Attitude Era's version of Hogan Andre. You know what I mean? But they didn't go that route. They started off strong with Big Show. Big Show, he had, I mean, to me, he moved around faster than Andre. But then again, I can't really judge Andre. Like, I started watching in the early 90s. So I wasn't even born yet when Andre was, on top in the 70s. They say Andre was pretty good. But by the time I got around to Andre, he was really slow. So when you compare him to Andre, Big Show was way better than Andre. Andre, by the time I started watching him, he did virtually nothing. Because of his condition. So there were and he's way better than guys that came after him, like Giant Gonzalez and the Great Khali. Come on, Giant Silva from the Oddities. These guys were terrible. So as far as giants go, when I'm talking about giants, like I wouldn't even put Kane in that. Kane and them are just big guys, But as far as giants, you got Andre the Giant, you got Giant Gonzalez, Khali, and Big Show stands head and shoulders above these guys from what I saw. So he was pretty good. All you needed was a smaller guy, like an Austin, a smaller babyface to work against him. He, or even a smaller heel, like when he finally turned. Doing a turn with him was the perfect thing, but the problem was in WWE, they turned him too fast. He came in February and he turned at WrestleMania. you know what I mean? They had legs on him as a heel, but they turned him too fast, and then they always kept turning him. It became a running joke. Oh, Big Show turns again. Big Show turns again. Like, how many times are you gonna have Big Show turn? You know, they WWE really dropped the ball with Big Show. They really, really did. You know what I mean? He could have been a much bigger star. He was great in the ring. He was very agile. He could do drop kicks and shit. You know what I mean? In the beginning, you know, like I said, a more like an Andre. If Andre could really move around, and had better promos. Could actually Andre was French, so he couldn't really speak English. Big Show was American; he could speak English. And he was actually funny. Like when he was doing, uh, those imitations of Hogan and Dusty Rhodes and stuff. That was actually funny and humorous. He had a humorous side to him, but WWE didn't utilize any of that. WCW, they definitely used him better. The problem was he got bogged down wrestling Hogan a lot, and Hogan didn't really want to put him over. Bret Hart, when he came to WCW, oh, that's an interesting question, Brian. I would have had him uh, form his own faction, form a version, a WCW version of the Hart Foundation, because their plan was to put him on Thunder and expand out of the United States into Canada anyway. So he was going to be a Thunder wrestler basically, and have Thunder as his brand. And he could have had Benoit, he could have had Jericho, right? And he could have had the guys he brought over like Davey Boy and Anvil, and they could have continued that. But if they weren't going to go that route, they could have done that later. But right off the bat, from Starcade '97, what they should have did was go right into the program with him and Hogan. And even if they were going to form that faction that I'm talking about, they could have had them as baby faces going against the black and white NWO. It would have been a lot more interesting than Kevin Nash's version of the NWO versus Hogan's version of the NWO, which was lame because, I mean, Kevin Nash got all the cool people in the NWO and the Wolfpack, and you could have built off of Starcade '97 to Hogan Brett in Starcade 1998. Like had a year of build the same way you did with Hogan Sting, a year of build with Brett. Bischoff totally dropped the ball with Brett when it came to Bret Hart. Because that's the match. That's the match WWE didn't do in '93. And there's history there. And fans knew about, by that time, the dirt sheets were coming out. And we were learning about the backstage drama that happened in '93 at WrestleMania 9 between Hogan and Brett. They couldn't mention it on TV, obviously, because it's a different company. But they could have said that, Hogan always tries to hog the spotlight. And Hogan, things that would appeal to WCW fans, saying it without saying it, basically. You know, and also the drama of Bret Hart costing Sting. I mean, costing Hogan and Starcade '97, built to Starcade '98, where Hogan wins the belt. I mean, Bret wins the belt rather from Hogan, because they ended up putting it back on him anyway. The Sting run was, failed. You could, and it could have been a Nitro versus Thunder thing. If Thunder was Bret's brand, Nitro could have been Hogan's brand. Hogan in the NWO versus, and it could have even built to a War Games match. Bret Hart's faction, the Canadian contingent, against Hogan's faction of the NWO. Like I said, way better than Nash and Goldberg. I mean, Nash and Hogan with the two NWOs. That was just lame. You know what I mean? Like people now they look back into nostalgia when it comes to the Wolf Pack. But let's be honest, the Wolf Pack was one of the lamest gimmicks, you know, that they came up with, trying to capitalize on hip hop. Like 50-year-old, 40-year-old white dudes acting gangster with the Wolf Pack. It was just stupid, you know, you know. And like I said, it was uneven because all the cool wrestlers that people liked from the NWO went to Nash. So Hogan just ended up with a bunch of jabronis: Brian Adams, Virgil, uh, Bagwell. Hogan ended up with the B team guys. Hogan was the only main eventer in there, and then they ended up turning Scott Hall, which didn't make sense. So the whole angle could have been scrapped, and it just could have been Hogan's faction of the NWO against Bret Hart's faction of the Hart Foundation guys. Mm. That's the match we missed out on in wrestling was Hogan Hart. We missed out on it in both promotions, in WCW and in WWE. We got it in WCW, but it was a random Nitro. And what making Bret Hart Hogan's lackey, wearing Hogan's T-shirt on TV? Why in the world would Bret Hart support Hulk Hogan, knowing what we know about their history going back years and years? It made no sense. You know, Bret Hart is claiming to be the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Yes, of course, Brian. We all did. That's what caused the decline. Brian says he always thought to himself that Vince McMahon should have had WCW versus WWF as a pay-per-view after he bought WCW. So many matches I would have loved to see. We all did. That's what caused the decline of wrestling after 2001. Wrestling has never recovered. I guess now it kind of did. Like when Triple H took over for WWE, like they say, it's another wrestling boom. But wrestling has never really recovered to the level of popularity it was in the late 90s after Vince McMahon's failed to do the right thing by bringing over WCW, the big name WCW talent, because he did, Brian. He did do WCW versus WWF, the Invasion pay per view in July of 2001, but he didn't have the main guys. He brought only over two main guys, two big stars that WCW had. He only brought over DDP and Booker T. He came out there when the simulcast, March 26, 2001. He came out there and he told everybody, who do you want to see? Lex Luger? And they had their reaction. Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, Goldberg, and they blew for Goldberg. They wanted to see Goldberg in the WWF, obviously, to get Goldberg versus Austin. And then he proceeds to bring nobody over. Like you had Mike Awesome and Lance Storm do the first attacks on the WWF guys. Yeah, I know. But he could have at least all you needed, and all you needed was like one or two, and they could have carried the storyline over. It didn't have to end in Survivor Series 2001. It could have carried over until WrestleMania. When you did get those guys, when you got Flair, when you got the NWO, when you got Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero came back that year. He had left WCW before in 2000, right before the buyout, but he was an important part of Nitro programming, and he came back that year. So many guys came over in 2002. You could have just kept the storyline going until they were able to come over. Why end it? You know, it should have been a War Games blow off. A War Games blow off of WCW versus WWF at WrestleMania. That's what I would have loved to see. Or maybe even at the next Survivor Series. Because they were having the next Survivor Series '02 in the Garden. Well, one-on-one matches, I would have loved to see Goldberg versus Austin, Hogan versus Austin, Sting versus Undertaker, Um, DX versus the NWO. Macho Man, if they could have get him to come back, if Vince would have aside his pettiness, you could have had Austin and Rock in a tag team match against Hogan and Savage, two different generations. Bret, if he would have came over, if he didn't have his stroke, I think he had a stroke in '02. But before he had a stroke, him coming over, him having the match with Vince when it really mattered, not in 2010 when the majority of people that were watching during the Monday Night Wars weren't watching anymore. They kind of grew up and fell out of professional wrestling. Some, like me, were still watching, but a lot were watching other things. MMA and stuff had become popular by then. People had forgotten about it. So by the time they did it, it didn't matter anymore. you know, and of course Hogan and Rock, which they did do, Flair and Undertaker, which they did do. So many dream matches, man. So much history, man. Um, Bischoff and Vince. Uh, they just dropped the ball with it. ECW didn't need to be in the feud. They only brought ECW into the feud, the Invasion storyline, because they didn't have enough WCW guys to make it seem credible. But the ECW guys didn't make any sense because the ECW was already, most of the ECW guys were already in WWF. The Dudleys were already there. Raven was already there. Rhino was already there. RVD was, like, it was a great moment. It was a great moment when Heyman got up from the announce desk and said the invasion has just been taken to the extreme, but it wasn't the same, because ECW, we were used to seeing ECW invading the WWF. That happened plenty of times. That happened in '97. That happened in '96. ECW was different than WCW. They weren't as adversarial. ECW and WWF was a friendly rivalry. They covered the same territory, basically, the Northeast. They worked together for years. Vince was secretly funding partially ECW. So it wasn't the same. Had a couple of great moments, but it could have did without ECW. The ECW didn't need to be in it. Because as far as most fans were concerned, ECW was an indie. A hyped up indie. And even with ECW, they didn't have Shane Douglas. They didn't have the Sandman. They had only Tommy Dreamer of the main core of ECW guys. So the whole storyline was just nonsense. And the fact that the guys from WCW came over later, the very next year, and basically, if you look at a lot of the matches for WrestleMania 18, basically a lot of the matches were WCW guys versus WWF guys, Scott Hall and Stone Cold, Rock and Hogan, Undertaker and Ric Flair, Christian and DDP. So why not just carry the storyline over? Look at this Bloodline storyline. It lasted 5 years basically. It just ended, finally the final nail in the coffin at this WrestleMania. So storylines have carried over for years and years. There's no reason why they had to end it in a year. But it was just that Vince didn't want to give WCW any credit. I mean, look at years and years later when Sting finally did come over in 2014. Look how he was made to look. Years and years later when it didn't matter anymore. Like, you own both companies content are on your network. You profit from the history and legacy of both companies. Why are you still trying to bury WCW? It's like Vince took it personal. Like, they're part of you now. There's no need to bury them, but he still did it. And almost every WCW wrestler before or after the buyout that he brought over, he buried them. Vader, right? Even Dusty Rhodes, his first run with the polka dots. Ric Flair, he won two WWF championships, yes, and the greatest Royal Rumble ever in history in '92. But Ric Flair, really, they only really brought Ric Flair over to job out to Hogan at WrestleMania 8. It didn't happen because, they changed plans, but still, that would have been the end result. Hogan would have beat him, only to make Vince's guy look better. You know, people say, "Oh, if Vince was in charge, the thing that happened with Joe Hendry at WrestleMania 41 would have never happened. Joe Hendry would have never been there." But yeah, he would have invited a guy like Hendry there and just buried him, just like Triple H did. You know, Vince buried WCW in a way that I've never. He really took it personal that WCW beat him 83 weeks in a row. Like, he really took that personal. Because WCW, guys, was the only promotion ever in wrestling history that has ever defeated Vince McMahon. No other promotion has. No other wrestling promotion. Yes, UFC defeated him in pay-per-view, but that's MMA. That's not wrestling. You know what I mean? So, as far as wrestling goes, nobody has defeated Vince ever, except WCW. Nobody. He's undefeated. The only blemish in his record is an 83-week losing streak against WCW, and he can't get over. He won the like him trashing WCW is like the Union Army trashing the Confederacy. Why are you trashing them? You beat them. Why are you still making them look like they're pieces of shit? Like you won the war. Like, what difference does it make? Like, you're still trying to bury something that didn't exist, that doesn't exist anymore, that hasn't existed for years. Whose legacy you own, whose history you own, whose legacy you profit from. Even all the documentaries make it seem like, oh, Vince lost a little bit, but he wasn't really hit that hard. He came back twice as hard. Look, the fact of the matter is, WCW, by the time 1996, 97, Vince McMahon was irrelevant. We look back with fondness now because of the Bret Hart Stone Cold Steve Austin match. But WrestleMania 13 had a horrible buy rate. Several WCW pay-per-views in 1997 had a higher buy rate than WrestleMania 13. I mean, let's just be honest. And it was a terrible show. Like, other than that one match, WrestleMania 13 was a terrible, terrible show. 97, Vince was almost irrelevant. Toy stores didn't even want to sell WWF figures anymore. They all wanted WCW stuff. So it's very possible that the war could have went the other way. The reason it didn't was because Eric Bischoff had no end game for the NWO. David says WrestleMania 12 sucked. I disagree with that, David. WrestleMania 12 was good. I'm surprised to hear you say that, David. A WrestleMania taking place in your own backyard where you're from, Anaheim, California, and you say it sucked? The competition hadn't heated up. WCW hadn't heated up in 96 yet. They wouldn't heat up until the middle of 96 when Hall and Nash got there. Late 95, they started in September of 95. September 11th, 1995 was the first time they ever went head to head. And they were pretty on an uneven keel. They both kind of sucked in late 1995, early 1996. WCW started to pick up a little bit of steam with the Randy Savage Ric Flair feud in early '96, but it was that was Brian. Now I disagree with David that WrestleMania 12 sucked, but as far as your question, what do I think of Michaels' reign in '96? He had good matches, but it was overshadowed by the NWO, so it kind of sucked. When he had good matches, but the problem was it wasn't engaging TV. So in order to see those matches, you had to buy the pay per view. But if nothing is drawing you in, if the TV isn't drawing you in to buy the pay per view, nobody will see it. You know what I mean? Like the match with Mankind at Mind Games was great, right? Two matches with Bulldog, um, on both In Your House, Beware of Dog, and King of the Ring '96 was a good match. But those pay per views had very low buy rates because by that time the NWO was really heating up. Especially late '96. The Sid match was amazing, the one at Survivor Series '96 that I was there for. But again, everybody was paying attention to the NWO. The difference was back then, and I'll tell you this as a kid, because as a kid, 93, 94, I had illegal cable, so I could watch every pay per view from both promotions. But by '96, I didn't have illegal cable anymore, and I had to choose between what pay per view to get, right? And I would always order WWF pay per views because WWF always had better pay per views, but Nitro had better TV in '96, '97. Nitro was good. They put all their eggs in the Nitro basket, and Nitro was amazing in '96, '97. But their pay per views sucked. What I mean? Their pay per view matches were horrible. WCW pay per view, even at its height, even during the 83 weeks, WWF always delivered in pay per view and house shows, and WCW always delivered better on TV. So the 83 weeks streak was only TV. Bischoff was only writing for TV. He really wasn't good at writing for pay per views. His pay per views were horrible. A lot of the pay-per-view matches featured Hulk Hogan, who, granted, he was on top as a heel and he was making a lot of money as a heel, the leader of the NWO. But like Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage at Halloween Havoc '96, where they wrestled over that wig, that toupee, that was one of the worst matches ever. you Even Hogan Piper at Starrcade '96. It had a good build, but once that, like Bruce Pritchard always says on his podcast, once that damn bell had to ring, once that bell rang and Hogan and Piper at Starrcade '96, that match fell flat. Yeah, and the build didn't matter. Like seeing those guys go at it, man, that'll put you to sleep. Yeah, they gave away Hogan and Goldberg on July of 1998. And it's a memorable moment, but imagine how much bigger it would have been if it was Starrcade '98. Again, Bischoff wrote for TV. He felt like TV was more important than the pay-per-view. And that was different. That was different than any other wrestling promotion before him. Because in wrestling, guys, TV was a way to get you to either go to the house show or buy the pay-per-view. That's the TV was the television show, whether it was Superstars, Raw, the WCW Saturday Night. That was that was a commercial to get you to either go to the house show in the early days before pay-per-view and after pay-per-view to get you to buy the pay-per-view. That was the purpose of a wrestling television show. The television show was a means to an end. That was the appetizer. What Bischoff did was he made the television show the main course, and he forgot about he forgot about the pay per view, which was supposed to be the main course. The pay per view is the main course. The show is only the appetizer. It's not a television show. What he did was like, if movies, imagine movies, right? Imagine your favorite movie where the trailer is better than the actual movie. That's what WCW. That's what WCW was like. Okay, why do I have to watch the movie now? You gave me 90% in the trailer, so no, yeah, David, I don't know about that. No, like I agree with Brian. Sid was not going to win the championship in '95. It was just people for Nash to wrestle. Like Vince had it in his mind that Nash was like a new Hogan, and that him wrestling other big guys like Sid and Mabel was smart. Even though, what could he really do with those guys? He wasn't really versatile. Nash had about 6 or 7 moves, and that was about it. And those guys were limited by their size. That's why those matches came off as really boring. The first In Your House is one of the worst pay-per-views of all time, too. You know what I mean? They gave away a house to this kid, Matt Capitelli, whatever. Stephanie Wyatt, this annoying bitch announcer that was the co-host of Mania with Todd Pettingill. Like it was just one of the stupidest things I ever seen. And then the following In Your House 2, with the Lumberjacks, that didn't help either. The In Your House pay-per-views didn't start getting good until they did the triple header match with Shawn Michaels and Diesel as WWF and Intercontinental Champion respectively, going against Owen and Yoko. But even that they botched, because like they won, but they had to surrender the titles the next night. I never understood that. I think that was a power play though, because but yeah, you watch In Your House, man. The first In Your House, that's a hard one. That's a hard one to get along. If you're doing a podcast or you're doing one of these live streams like I'm doing now, and you and your topic of your video is to a watch along for In Your House 1, man, you better fast forward. You better fast forward to Bret Hart versus Hakushi, because Bret Hart versus Hakushi is the only match on that show that is any good. The concept is terrible. The delivery is terrible with Stephanie Wyatt and like Todd Pettingill. They had no chemistry. Like they just found a female Todd Pettingill and they put her in there, and the matches are terrible. The only good match on that whole show is Hakushi versus Bret Hart. And that's a testament to Bret Hart, because he could make anybody seem interesting, even Hakushi. Best In Your House? Canadian Stampede, 1990, July of 97. That was the only pay-per-view, In Your House pay-per-view, in my opinion, that made it seem like it could be its own standalone pay-per-view, because it was that good. It was that memorable. People don't talk about the other In Your Houses. Nobody talks about Diesel versus Sid. Nobody talks about those two matches they had. Even the triple header match, nobody talks about that. Whenever they reference an In Your House, the best one they always talk about, the number one they always talk about, is July of 97, because it was just incredible. The Hart Foundation was so over in Canada as baby faces. They cheered. Yeah, that one was good too. That would be my second pick, the Final Four, '97. That was a good one too. Cold Day in Hell was pretty good. The main event between Taker and Austin, it proved that Taker. That was when like I felt like, damn, Austin's gonna really make it because he could work with anybody. He could work outside of Bret Hart in main event programs and still make it interesting. uh, Bad Blood, first Bad Blood was great. October of '97. '97, we pretty much determined that 1997 had the best in your houses. '97 is a really underrated year for the WWF because that was the pre-Attitude Era. You know what I mean? Like they were taking it to another level, but they weren't going as far as they would go. You know what I mean? They didn't go into like complete Attitude Era mode. Like Russo was giving his input creatively, but he was still reined in by Cornette because Cornette was still on the booking committee in '97. So he wasn't by '98. Cornette had left, and he was working on founding OVW. So uh, Russo, um, what happened for him? I think he would turn babyface again, and he would probably maybe a tag team match with him and Austin down the road, where him and Austin finally put their differences aside to take on DX. That's assuming Michael stays for the rest of '98. But I don't know, because Brett would seem kind of odd in the Attitude Era. It was almost like Brett had to leave for the Attitude Era to really become the Attitude Era. He would seem kind of, out of place, kind of like Bob Backlund. Bob Backlund would seem out of place in the Hogan era. That's why it was a necessity that Backlund had to lose the championship in '83 and leave professional wrestling because he didn't fit in. Like change has to happen for other change to happen. Just like with Cena, would Cena have really become the star he became if Brock Lesnar stayed, or if The Rock stayed, or Austin didn't retire? Certain things need to happen. Like now, Cena had to leave. Cena had to go away in Hollywood for Roman to really. Roman's heel turn wouldn't have been as impactful if Cena was on TV with him every week, burying him. No, but David, he's not trying to insult you. What he's saying is that that idea that Sid is going to beat Diesel was a ridiculous idea because Sid was not ready to be in '95. Sid was not ready to. Sid was not ready to be the champion in '95. First of all, Ted DiBiase was his manager after he left Shawn Michaels, and Ted DiBiase was a horrible manager. Like Ted DiBiase was a great worker and great at getting himself over. Like the $1 Million Man gimmick is one of the top 10 gimmicks in WWF history. But as a manager and as an announcer, getting other people over, he sucked. He was the worst manager in WWF history. you know, and having him as the manager of Sid as the champion, it wouldn't have seemed right. Would have seemed weird. Like, and where would they have gone with that? Okay, Diesel just won the championship in November of '94, right? From Backlund. You take the title off of him in May of '95 and put it on Sid, a heel. The houses would have dropped. Like WWE might have never not existed to this point. Because where do you go with that? First of all, it was still a lot of kayfabe in '95, and a heel champion wasn't going to draw. The only way you can make that work is have Michaels come back early and move Michaels to the main event and have him chase Sid up until WrestleMania 12. But then you don't get the Iron Man match. So it doesn't even work from a fantasy perspective, David. Usually you have a lot of creative insights and I agree with a lot of what you said, but I got to go with Brian here. That's not a good. I, I wouldn't have went that direction. No. Uh, you could have turned Razor Ramon heel, and you could have had Razor Ramon take the belt off Diesel if you wanted to take the belt off Diesel early, because they had history and they have good. They had Nash and Hall had good chemistry when they were Razor and Diesel wrestling. The series of matches they had, even the one on Superstars where Diesel wins the IC belt in '94, that was a good match. And that was an era, '94, where they didn't really have good matches on Superstars because they were moving away from that and moving to Raw as their A show. But that was a good one. And the match they had at SummerSlam with Walter Payton's interference, that was a good one. And they should have tried again with turning Razor heel. That would have kept Scott Hall a little fresh. What made Hall stale was that he never turned heel again. Right, exactly. That's the point I'm trying to. Again, David, you're jumping the gun. You're saying that Razor should have beat Bret Hart at Royal Rumble '93 in Sacramento. Okay, you're jumping the gun again, like you are with Sid. Razor wasn't what did with Sid in '95. Razor wasn't ready for a world title run in '93. If you're going to put the belt on Razor, the time would have been swap him for Diesel and have him beat Backlund at WrestleMania. At the end of Survivor Series, right? And then have him go on the run with the championship in '95. But in '93, no, Razor wasn't ready for that. And again, you got to remember, you're dealing with the WWF. Vince McMahon, from the time he took over WWE to the time he ended his relationship with his own company in 2023, Vince McMahon, if he had his preference, would always want to put the belt on a babyface. That was just the way he booked. He learned it from his father. That's what his father did. His father had the belt on Bruno Sammartino for 7 years. And that's what he did with Hogan. That's what he did with like heel champions. Their reigns were always short. Heel champions were never really that dominant in WWF. They were always a way to get it off of one babyface to put it on another babyface. Mostly, most heel champions in WWF history and WWE were transitional champions. Now the exception, they don't start making the exception until Triple H, really. Triple H was a dominant heel champion from 2002 to 2005, but that was because he was Vince's son-in-law. But even after, and they were in a transition period during the early Ruthless Aggression era where they were trying to build the next big babyface. But once they built Cena up, Cena dominated. You hardly ever saw heel champions with long title reigns. Look, you didn't have a heel walk out of WrestleMania victorious until 2000. And that was Triple H. That was the whole history of WrestleMania. So that was never going to happen with Razor as the heel champion walking out with Bret. And plus, that match was a horrible match in a way. Like, they could have done much better. I think Razor was injured during that match. Yeah, you're right, Brian. Technically, yeah. But they did what they did because Vince had that philosophy. Vince wanted to send. He believed that babyfaces should always close the show to send the fans home happy. That was different than the way that WCW booked. WCW always booked dominant heel champions with a babyface chasing. Babyface title reigns in WCW were always shorter. More often than not, you would see heels as long-running champions and babyfaces with shorter runs. Even Sting was chasing most of the time more than he was holding. Because the idea is the excitement is when the babyface chases. And we're seeing that with Cody. Everybody was behind Cody when he was chasing. People wanting him to finish his story, people wanting him to be victorious. Once he wins, his title reign was boring because the chase is over, the excitement is over. And plus, he had no heels to really face. You know, he had no solid rivalries that he could sink his teeth into. Yeah, I do. I do, Brian. That's why I'm referencing stuff that happened, uh, you know, this year and last year. I still do. Yeah, I do. you know, do you? But I've been watching it for so long since 1990 that I've taken breaks. Most of 2006 I didn't watch. You know what I mean? Because I felt like I'm a deeply religious person, and I was too young to really understand the magnitude of Stone Cold Steve Austin's catchphrase, so that really didn't offend me. But like the things that they were doing with Vince McMahon and uh, Vince McMahon in a handicap match with God, and Vince in the church spitting holy water. 2006 really turned me off. Uh, Brian asked about Cena. Was no, his heel turn was not absolutely better than Hogan's because look at the result of it. You know where they messed up was telling people that this was going to be Cena's last year. Once again, when you tell somebody that a person that these kids grew up with, that this generation's Hulk Hogan is going to retire, of course they're going to cheer him. Of course they'll cheer him because this will never see him again, right? So how do you expect him to get any heat when you just told the people that he's going away, he'll never wrestle again? You know, I don't understand the logic behind that. I mean, maybe the logic is I'll take the WWE title with me and you'll never have wrestling again. But we know that's not going to happen, right? We know that he will eventually lose the championship. So why introduce something as implausible as that? You know, you know, you never booking 101. You never want to introduce something permanent in wrestling. Other than a retirement, because people come out of in and out of retirement forever for whatever stipulation. But like, you never want to say, okay, if I lose this match, I'm taking the WWE Championship with me forever, because that's not going to happen, right? And then you end up screwing the future because if you do that and then you hold a tournament for a vacated title, the fans are going to look at that new champion, whomever he is, as illegitimate because Cena's the real champion because he never lost it. And if he loses it, you run the potential, unless that guy is really over as a face. Wow. Brian says people says it was such a shocker, but you're dealing with a different generation though, Brian. A lot of the people that are talking about Cena's heel turn was such a shocker was because they weren't you were at Bash at the Beach when he turned. Okay, what was that environment like? I'm just curious. Uh, a lot of those people weren't even alive when Hogan turned heel. So to them, Cena's their new Hogan. But again, there was no mystery to it. There was no swerve to it. Cena didn't really swerve the people, did he? No. The whole thing of a mystery third man, that's what made the thing special, right? Because it made sense. There was no build to it. The thing would have been better if Rock would have offered Cena the chance to turn. Offer Cena the chance to turn and then make it a shock. You had no build to it. It just came out of nowhere. you know, Triple H is not so good at setting angles correctly. You know what I mean? Like he's good at executing them. He's good at getting to the end. But what about the middle? What about the beginning? There needs to be a reason. There needs to be a motivation. Why did Cena turn heel? Oh, because the fans booed him all these years. But they've been booing you. And like they've been booing you. Hogan's motivation was simple, even though they didn't outright say it, because when they even alluded to it, they got sued. The motivation was that Hall and Nash were coming from the WWF and invading WCW. So who better? Who's Mr. WWF? Who's the guy that built the WWF? The house that WWF was the house that Hogan built. So who better to lead the WWF invasion of WCW than Hulk Hogan? I mean, it wrote itself. But with the Cena thing, I mean, Cena and Cody it was never mentioned until after Cena turned heel that Cody was, he mentored Cody, that Cody were best friends. When Hogan turned, he dropped the leg on who? Randy Savage. Like, think of how that fits perfect in fans' mind. They know the history. There's no previous history between John Cena and Cody. And the way it fit with Hogan was like, you thought as a fan, you're like, damn, maybe Hogan been plotting this for the last 2 years, to invade WCW. Like the NWO storyline was the best storyline ever written in wrestling history, the beginning of it. Like, that was an amazing storyline. The way it played out, the twists and turns, Hogan's heel turn, Hall and Nash, the fact that they came from WCW, the fact that all the guys were coming over, from WWF, and they were all coming to the NWO. It made it seem like it was a war. Like they did the invasion better than Vince did the invasion. Like, and the fact that it happened in Florida, Hogan's home state, and he got booed the way he got booed, it was just perfect. It wasn't Cena's heel turn, can't compare. And Cena's not convincing as a heel. Hogan is an actual asshole. Like he's convincing as a heel. Cena just comes off as he's just pretending to be mad. Like he's pretending to be a heel. Like he's going out there. He's still, and again, what fucked it up was Cena still looks like babyface Cena. Still coming out in the jorts, still coming out in the bright colored clothes, still coming out with the Cena merch, still coming out to My Time Is Now, still doing everything that John Cena does, only as a heel. Hogan had to change his whole persona. Gone was the red and yellow, replaced completely with black. Gone was the hulking up. Gone was everything that Hulk Hogan, the babyface, did, Hollywood Hogan did not do. Everything that John Cena heel... Everything that John Cena heel does is the same thing that the John Cena babyface did. Like, what's different? Roman Reigns' heel turn was better than this, because Roman Reigns, the difference between Roman Reigns, the big dog, and Roman Reigns, the bloodline Roman Reigns, was night and day. Roman Reigns completely changed his demeanor, completely changed the way he did promos, completely changed a lot of the ways he wrestled. You know, you can't do the exact same things as a heel and a babyface because then fans are not going to care. Some are going to cheer for you and some are going to boo for you. You know, and like what Cena should have did was he should have said, fuck all that and come out as the Cena that we see in the real world. When Cena's out there doing interviews for the Peacemaker and other movies that he's in a three-piece suit. He's not using any slang. He's not using any rap, trying to act like a rapper or whatever from his early days. He's completely a different person. The motherfucker looks like Ernest uh, from the movie, Jim Varney. You know what I mean? Like Ernest. That's how he looks. You know what I mean? A different person than the John Cena, the wrestling character. He needed to be that. He needed to be that guy. You know, the Cena that we see in the movie interviews. And that guy is a heel. HBK versus Rock. I say HBK. But because HBK could run circles around The Rock. But that doesn't mean he'll win. Again, probably Vince will book The Rock anyway. But I would have loved to have seen that. That was my dream match. That was another dream match that never happened. But that was because, and they kind of set it up. Remember when in '99 when they did the Iron Man match between Triple H and The Rock, and Michaels cost The Rock with a super kick? I thought, oh, they're finally going to do it, but it never went that way. Michaels said apparently he said something insulting to The Rock's grandmother, and The Rock took it personally. He never wanted to work with Michaels. You know, which I don't get because everybody always talks about Hogan played politics, and he did, but Rock played just as much politics as Hogan. Like he decided who he wanted to work with and who he didn't want to work with, who he wanted to put over and who he didn't want to put over. Look how he is now, like with The Rock calling his own shots. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they could have wrestled David, but I wouldn't have ended the Undertaker streak at all. And if you were going to do it, I would have did it with Punk, or I would have waited and did it with Roman, somebody that needed, or waited to do it with Bray Wyatt, maybe. You know, but The Rock, no, The Rock, that's just as wasted as Brock Lesnar. You know what I mean? Like Brock Lesnar was a waste. Why have The Rock do it? And plus, by the time of WrestleMania 27, Rock was a part timer. Why waste it on a part timer? That's just as bad as wasting it on Brock. Technically, Brock's turned out to be a bigger waste because Brock has been basically expunged from the history of WWE because of the Vince McMahon scandal. So basically, Undertaker ended his streak for nothing. You know? But having The Rock end it, no, I wouldn't have did that because The Rock didn't need it. Brock didn't need it either. What would The Rock have gained from ending the Undertaker streak at WrestleMania 27, David, in your fantasy booking? You know what I mean? It's a good match. I would have did it, to have The Rock do something at WrestleMania 27 other than the stupid shit he did. You say wrestle, I say mania. You say wrestle, I say mania. But I wouldn't have ended the streak. I would have had Undertaker go over, That's a good match, but the result, I don't agree with that. I didn't even agree with Brock ending it. What was the purpose of Brock ending it? Maybe Taker chose that, you know what I mean? And people say, oh, well, Brock had legitimacy. All of a sudden, his UFC record matters in WWE. Legitimacy. What the hell? We know it's a work. Oh, he had legitimacy. What the? Oh, yeah, because he beat The Undertaker in an octagon, right? Legitimacy, that doesn't matter in WWE. You know, like that's one of the most laughable reasons for picking Brock Lesnar to end the streak. Oh, he had legitimacy. Like, so you mean to say that the Undertaker is such a mark for UFC that that he would risk his own career, to put over a UFC, an ex-UFC champion like Brock Lesnar because he has legitimacy? What the hell? What the hell does that mean, right? Like, he has legitimacy. So why do you, Kurt Angle has more legitimacy? He's an Olympic gold medalist. Why do you lose the streak to Angle? You know, he never even wrestled Angle at WrestleMania, which would have been a hell of a match. Angle versus Undertaker at Mania. But yeah, with Taker, we know he's a huge UFC mark. He's like, I mean, I think he's the biggest UFC fan of all the WWE wrestlers. Like when they bought when Endeavor bought WWE, probably he probably marked out, like, for real, like, oh my god, you know. Remember when Taker came back and he was the hybrid dead man, and he was like, after '04 when he was dead man and he was half dead man and half like his real self, and they would say that, oh, the Undertaker is the best striker in the game. You know, and that's when he invented Hell's Gate. You know, he eventually learned how to do it really good, but at first, like, if you watch both, like I did, you're like, damn, that Gogo Plata, you know, that Taker is putting on, that looks really shitty. You know, like, no, I think there's a bigger mark for UFC in WWE though. The bigger mark for UFC and MMA and WWE, other than Undertaker, is Shane McMahon. Shane McMahon. Shane McMahon is the biggest MMA guy in all of professional wrestling. Like, he loves MMA. Remember that match with AJ Styles at WrestleMania 33, where like Shane is trying to do jujitsu, like he's fucking Hoist Gracie. Oh, I'm pulling a guard. And then when they give Shane the book in 2020, what's yeah, I know, Brian. We have a video on that in the channel that we just did earlier today. I talked about some of the stuff like that. And when I did the 2019 in review, where I talk about everything, politics, current events, all that. And I talk about, I didn't see it coming. I didn't see WWE getting a resurgence and UFC getting knocked down a peg or two. You know, I didn't really see that coming. I thought that the wrestling would be severely diminished and that UFC would dominate. You know what I mean? Because that's the way it looked in 2019, you know, but now the tables have turned. Now celebrities are talking about WWE. They're talking about professional wrestling. They're not really talking about MMA anymore. You know. I think what happened was the retirement of Conor McGregor, the loss of Conor McGregor, the fact that John Jones is the champion, but he's almost never on any of the cards. And it's basically his championship is illegitimate because it's like they just gave it to him because he never beat Francis Ngannou, and Ngannou walked out of the organization. And and the fact that the pay-per-views are sky high. You have to buy. You have to not only you have to subscribe to ESPN, but you have to buy the pay-per-view separately. Which when they did the Endeavor merger, I'm like, oh, right, and that too. That's another reason. They put on too many shows. Makes it impossible to keep up with. One pay-per-view a month was fine. Exactly. Endeavor got greedy. I mean, TKO, Endeavor, whatever. And they're doing this. They're gonna do the same thing with WWE. They're gonna do the exact same thing with WWE that they did with UFC. They're gonna end up overexposing the product. I think WrestleMania 41 was an indication that the new rule might not be as sweet as we thought it was going to be. You know what I mean? Like, if Triple H is allowed to continue to book the way he wants and TKO doesn't step in and they demand too much from him and burn him out, then he'll be fine. But if they do what they did with UFC, it's not gonna end well for WWE, like it didn't end well for UFC. And another thing too is, and I'm not trying to be xenophobic, but when it comes to UFC, there aren't that many good American fighters, and people want to see the American fighters. Most of the fighters are from overseas, Dagestan especially. You know what I mean? And that really alienates. That's really fucked baseball up. The lack of American talent. Most of the talent is from Dominican Republic or other countries in Latin America, and that makes people feel like they can't relate to it. You know what I mean? It happens with boxing all the time. Whenever they have an American champion on top in boxing, records go through the roof. Whenever they don't, we start to see the boxing not drawing. When you have the likes of the Klitschko brothers or even Tyson Fury on top. Brian says, how long do you give the WWE? I give it about 10 more years, Brian. TKO is going to run into the ground. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have the passion that Vince has. They don't love it like Vince loved it. And that's just the reality of it. Vince, it was his baby. He put his blood, sweat, and tears into that company. Ari Emanuel, the bosses at TKO, they don't love it like Vince loved it. To them, it's just a moneymaker. And when it ceases to make the amount of money for them that they want to make, that they feel it can make, then they'll sell it, or they'll run it to the ground. Disney did it with Star Wars. Star Wars was very similar. George Lucas created it. It was George Lucas's universe. Yes, he did some horrible things with it. He fucked it up in some ways, but it was still his mistakes. It was still his baby. It was still something he cared about. When he sold it, at first it was just like with TKO. Everybody loved it, right? Oh my God. The Force Awakens was like WrestleMania 40 was the TKO. Oh, it's the best thing ever. It's so brilliant. Look at the new ownership. It's glad to have the original owner out. Now, WrestleMania 41 is The Last Jedi. It's like, oh, this isn't what we thought it was going to be. You know what I mean? This actually sucks. Can we get the old owner back? The guy that put his blood, sweat, and tears in it? No, because you ran that guy off. You know what I mean? Thank you, Brian. Thank you. I appreciate it. Uh, you ran that guy off. You know what I mean? Wrestling fans did the same thing to Vince that Star Wars fans did to George Lucas. Take the sex scandal out of it. All they did for years was bitch. Vince sucks. Vince should just step down. So he steps down. He's tired of the bullshit. He gives his company over to a mega conglomerate. And at first it's cool, but a honeymoon always has to end, and it's ended. WrestleMania 41 is wrestling's last Jedi. Now they're starting to see that the mega corporation doesn't really care. Oh, the honeymoon is over. And you can blame it on The Rock, David. And The Rock does bear some responsibility. But in the end, he's just a board member. He's the final boss is only a gimmick. It was their fault for putting the baton in his hand. It was their fault for approving that storyline. And Triple H is trying, you know what I mean? But how long before Triple H taps out and says, you know what, fuck this? And then they put some corporate Yahoo in charge. And then we see WCW all over again. Somebody who doesn't care. Somebody who's detached from it. And then what? Then WWE's dead. WWE as we knew it, Brian, actually, to answer your question, I retract that. It's already dead. It's WWE in name only. It exists, but it doesn't exist. It's not what we grew up with. It's not what we grew up loving. It's different. It looks like WWE. It talks like WWE, but it's not WWE. It's something completely different. It's a different company under WWE's name. David says Jake Roberts never won the Intercontinental Championship. Jake Roberts never won any championship. You forget about the Intercontinental Championship. Jake Roberts, if wrestling was real, Jake Roberts would be the worst wrestler ever because he never won any championship. And part of that was because he didn't need it. Championships are sometimes put on wrestlers to make them more popular. Jake was always popular with the fans, whether he was a heel or a babyface. And a part of it was because Jake Roberts had a lot of personal problems that he just could not be trusted with. To hold the Intercontinental Championship, literally in reality terms, not kayfabe, but in real terms, it meant that you were main eventing the B towns. So Hogan would do Madison Square Garden, but the Intercontinental Champion would do. That's a controversial opinion, Brian, but I respect it. He says it was women's wrestling that made him stop watching. I respect it, David. Brian, sorry, not David. Brian, I respect it. I don't want to get banned off YouTube. There's a lot of SJWs on YouTube, but I'll just say it. You're probably right. The women and the way they went full force with it. Let's be honest, women's wrestling has always existed in wrestling. Wrestling was the first athletic endeavor to really involve women. But when they started like pushing the women's revolution and all that shit, it kind of made it. It kind of seemed like they were going for a social agenda, the same social agenda that the rest of society was going for. It's an overused term now, but the woke agenda, we see it in action movies. We see it in politics. We see it everywhere. And Wrestling had some of it. Vince was kind of a bulwark against it. He was against it. Obviously, Vince is a he's a politically he's a conservative. You know what I mean? So he kind of worked against it. But now that now that we have a new bosses in charge, it's going to get only worse. They're going to start pushing this even further, just like other companies are. You know, just like Disney did with Star Wars. This idea that it has to have that everything has to be totally equal. You know what I mean? Kind of, wokeness agenda. I mean, there's no other word to describe it. I know that's a controversial term because of its overuse. You know what I mean? But there's no really word to describe it. When I was doing my WrestleMania review series, I joked that WrestleMania 35 was wokeomania. You know what I mean? Because the way the storylines were structured. Yeah. And that's only going to get worse with these guys because Ari Emanuel's political affiliation is definitely to the left. I mean, he's Rahm Emanuel's brother. Who did Rahm Emanuel work for? I don't really want to get political, but uh, we talked about it before on the channel. You know what I mean? His connections. So, but how can you not? You know what I mean? The late 2010s was a complete social engineering throughout all of movies. And it got a lot of people upset, not just in wrestling, but in popular culture in general. Terminator, female lead. Star Wars, female lead. Captain Marvel, female lead. All these strong female leads. So there's nothing wrong with it, but when you overdo anything, it gets tiring after a while, right? It it gets annoying. Okay, yeah, Trish Stratus, but okay, David, I know you love Trish Stratus, and there's nothing wrong with loving a female talent. She was a great trailblazing talent for women's wrestling. I'm not denying that, but I'm just saying that pushing, like Brian is saying, pushing women in every single segment, comes off as social engineering to me. I feel like Stephanie McMahon is kind of woke, in that regard. And she was the main one pushing that. Vince served as a bulwark against that. When Vince was in charge, he only let WWE get bust so woke. You know what I mean? Like he never completely went off the cliff when other companies were going off the cliff with stuff like this. In the late 2010s, they were really going full on with this. Like I said, Terminator, Star Wars, Marvel, they were pushing this and pushing this, and people reacted to this negatively. You know what I mean? Because people don't want to be told what to like. What I mean? Yeah, the Women's Royal Rumble in 2018. I thought that was a one-off thing. Honestly, I thought that because I thought this whole woman thing was actually built because they were trying to bring Ronda in. I didn't realize that this was gonna outlast Ronda's stay. You know, like I thought that was a one-off. And obviously it wasn't. You know what I mean? And they're staying with it now. But it, it was Stephanie McMahon's engineering. Stephanie McMahon has nothing but daughters, and she wants to make sure that the women's division in the company is alive, so that when Aurora, her oldest, that wants to get into the business, can get into the business, and not have to be a valet or a diva. So that's what that's all about. But also about appealing to more sponsors. because this is what companies are looking for: female empowerment, right? I'm female, hear me roar. This grander scheme of feminism throughout the world and the United States, at least the Western world, anyway. It was funny because David and I talked about it uh, to the to the point where at the same time they were pushing the women's revolution and having their own pay-per-view and having their own Royal Rumble that year, 2018, it was juxtaposed to that. They were doing shows in Saudi Arabia. So you're pushing feminism, but you're collaborating with the most anti-feminist, anti-female, one of the most, probably the most, besides Iran, one of the most anti-female regimes in the world. You know what I mean? Like I said at that time when I did the review on in 2018, I said that's like that's like you're pro civil rights, but you're collaborating with a Southern promotion in the 1960s that prohibits racial integration. You know, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't support discrimination and at the same time support empowerment. It made no sense. You know? So, Brian, you may get your wish because they're doing the Royal Rumble this year in 2026 in Saudi Arabia, and they're not going to allow the women wrestlers in the Royal Rumble with the way they dress, some of them. Rhea Ripley is not going to be allowed to wear the things that Rhea Ripley wears in Saudi Arabia. You know, they're going to make them wrestle. If they do have them wrestle at all, they're going to make them wrestle in the long-ass T-shirts. And that'll ruin a lot of their gimmicks. So I don't think that WWE will be doing the Women's Royal Rumble this year coming up in 2026 because being in Saudi. And they don't want to really mess up that Saudi deal either because that money is sweet. You know what I mean? That Saudi revenue is juicy. I mean, Jamal Khashoggi's death in 2018 couldn't even mess that up. You know, the plane got derailed. The Crown Jewel plane got derailed one year, and the guys almost didn't make it back from there, but they still kept going there. You know? So, I mean, I can't see a wrestler like Rhea Ripley wrestling in Saudi Arabia. That's just not going to happen. I mean, her ass practically, or Liv Morgan, like their asses practically show when they the attire they wrestle in. And if you put her, especially Rhea, if you put her in different attire, she's not as over. Like that's the point of her gimmick. So why even have her wrestle there? You know. They're giving Saudi Arabia their own pay-per-view. Like, how soon before we started seeing WrestleManias in Saudi Arabia? You know, Saudi Mania. Yeah, Trish Stratus was cool, David, but you know, I get Brian's point. I agree with it. I'm not anti-feminist. I'm not against women's wrestling. Don't think that, guys. You know, I'm fine with it sprinkled here and there, but you know, it's a novelty, and the novelty wears off when you see like 4 or 5 women matches in one night, and half of them aren't even that talented. I mean, it used to just be a bathroom break match. You know, back in the 2000s and in the 2010s, the early 2010s, and back in the days when we were kids, it didn't even exist. You know, we were lucky to get Bull Nakano and Alundra Blaze at SummerSlam '94, which was a good match, but that's because it was a rarity. But it just seemed to coincide with the political agenda that was going on in the late 2010s. This girl power political agenda, like it's almost It's almost like Hillary didn't win, so they had to push it on us in popular culture, you know? Yeah. I mean, Trish is a great legend, David. There's no doubt about it. When she beat Lita in '06 with the sharpshooter, yeah. I mean, yeah. But, I mean, I can't say I dislike it. You know what I mean? In that aspect, anyway. Who doesn't want to see Liv Morgan's ass? Who doesn't want to see Rhea Ripley's ass? You know what I mean? Like, but they can't treat every women's wrestler like she's a freaking like she could go out there and have 5-star matches like Shawn Michaels and Eddie Guerrero. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like they're not some that aren't any good. It's just like the midget. I mean, the little people wrestlers. You know, Torito versus El Torito versus uh, Hornswoggle, the WLC match back in 2014. That was a good match, but I wouldn't want to see a bunch of El Toritos and Hornswoggles walking around having 4 or 5 matches on a card. Keep it to a minimum. I like tag team wrestling. I wouldn't want to see an all tag team pay per view. You have to have a little bit of everything. You know what I mean? A smorgasbord, I feel. Having 4 or 5. But one thing I do have to disagree with you, though, Brian. The best match on the card at this year's WrestleMania for night one, excuse me, night two, was the women's match. The triple threat: Io Sky, Rhea, and Bianca. I watched that with a lot of people that didn't like wrestling or they hadn't watched wrestling in years. And they said that match was awesome. You know what I mean? So certain girls can carry it, certain ones can't. But when it becomes a political or social agenda and it's shoved down our throats, then of course we reject it just like anything else. Like, remember when WWE was partnering with Susan G. Komen and the ropes were pink? Yeah, we had 2 examples. What do you think, Brian, about having every year at WrestleMania be night one and night two? You think that's gonna getting repetitive and a little bit stupid? I think it is. I mean, it was necessary for 2020 because of the circumstances with the COVID. But I mean, come on now. Like, they're sitting there pretending like CM Punk achieved his goal of why he left WWE in 2014. And he actually, they're sitting there, oh, CM Punk main event to WrestleMania, and that was his goal. CM Punk main event to WrestleMania on night one. Come on, are you serious? That wasn't the real main event. He was closer to the main event when he wrestled Undertaker at 29. Like, for example, This WrestleMania 41, it didn't need 2 nights. It wasn't it wasn't stacked enough for a 2 night extravaganza. It just wasn't. You had a lot of wasted matches. Yeah, exactly. Like you had a lot of wasted matches. Did you need Bianca Belair and Naomi? No. Did you need the War Raiders versus? You definitely didn't need the War Raiders versus New Day. New Day shouldn't even exist in 2025. That match, and we found out later that that match was only put in there as a product placement, as an advertisement. So that's what we're doing now. We're having matches dedicated to the drumstick ice cream cone. Brian says he doesn't know how they have the money to pay these wrestlers. Uh, that's an interesting question, Brian. I think it's a force of habit. I love wrestling, and it's something that I enjoy. I love talking about it with you guys on YouTube, and it has a special place in my heart. Um, there are little gems. There are times when, even though I know it's a work, like the main event for night one, the main event for night one, I knew what was going to happen. I knew everybody knew the Seth Rollins, pretty much everybody knew that Rollins was going to turn heel and join up with Heyman. But you can't tell me that the drama, for me at least, the way they built it up wasn't well executed and you didn't get excited. You know what I mean? So it's for those moments where you're able to suspend your disbelief. And quite honestly, wrestling is one of those things that it's almost as fun. Look at the fun we're having. The video is almost 2 hours long, more than 2 hours, 2 hours and 22 minutes. We're having this discussion, talking and laughing about the horrible shit that wrestling puts on and the great shit. So the wrestle crap is almost as entertaining to me as the good stuff. So I think that's why. You know what I mean? It just something that WWE has been a part of my life since I was 7 years old. And I turned 40. Uh, which WrestleMania sucked? A lot of them. David, you were here for the 40 the review. The reviews are on the channel in the archives, Brian. If you want to check them out under my playlist, WrestleMania reviews. Every WrestleMania is there from 1 to 41, where I review each and every one. And David was here for most of them. So WrestleMania 9 sucked, WrestleMania 11 sucked, WrestleMania 27 sucked, WrestleMania 32 sucked, and WrestleMania 41 sucked. That's my list. And 2 and 7 were one match shows. 13 was a one match show. 6 was a one match show. Yeah, you said that already, David. Yeah. Vegas is bad luck for wrestling. WWE should never do another WrestleMania in Vegas. The two they've had in Vegas have been horrible and notable for a veteran wrestler ruining a WrestleMania and a stupid interference at the end. Both WrestleMania 9 and WrestleMania 41. They should never do another WrestleMania in Vegas. That's Vegas' snake bit for them. Every time they go there, they bomb. And plus, the Vegas crowd is never really into the shit anyway. I mean, now you can't really judge 41 because people come from all over the world now. But like from a local point, Vegas has never had a good wrestling show. Vegas is not a wrestling town. They don't have dedicated wrestling fans like Chicago, like Florida, like Texas. You never hear people when you talk about wrestling history. You never hear people say, "Oh, I was in the Vegas territory, and I was, you know, I was, I, I set the territory on fire." You never hear that. Yeah, me too. You never hear a wrestler say, "Oh, Vegas was my Vegas was my town." You know what I mean? Like I tore it down in Vegas, man. I had the territory on fire. Like you hear about Dusty in Florida in the '70s, or Flair in the Carolinas, or Bruno in New York, or Hogan in New York, or Classy Freddie Blassie in LA, or the Von Erichs and the Freebirds in Texas, right? Or Junkyard Dog in Louisiana. You never hear that about Vegas. No wrestler ever says, "Oh man, Vegas, I was running that town and I was selling out arenas," because it doesn't exist. Vegas is dominated by boxing and UFC because you can gamble on it. You can't gamble on wrestling because it's not real. You know what I mean? So the wrestling mecca was a WrestleMania is a place that's never had a WrestleMania, and that wrestling mecca is Memphis. Memphis has never had a WrestleMania. Sure, it's not a big metropolis. It's not Las Vegas. It's not New York. It's not Miami. It's not LA. But it's Memphis, and it might not mean a lot in the scheme of things in all of U.S. history as far as the economy, but it means a lot to wrestling fans, and it means a lot to wrestling history. Memphis is, in my opinion, the mecca, one of the meccas of professional wrestling. A city that you can't talk about wrestling history without talking about it. Just like Tampa, just like New York, just like uh, Dallas. Just like Houston. You know, Vegas is an odd choice, but I know why they did it. It was a way to solidify their union with the UFC. It's the UFC's town. The UFC basic. Dana White did the introduction of WrestleMania 41. What does that tell you? Like this was the first TKO WrestleMania where it was wrestling, but it felt like the UFC, like a fake UFC. 40. I'm 40, Brian. And a lot of these towns never had WrestleManias. These great wrestling towns, they've never had WrestleManias. Tampa did in 2008, and again well, no, because that was Orlando. I think Tampa only had one. Daytona has never had one. Brian's from there; he would know. You know, New York has had several. Of the ones New York has had, I wasn't at number one because I wasn't born yet. I was born in August. They had it in March. But I was at 10. I was at 20, and I was at 29. I wasn't at 35. I didn't want to go to 35 because again, they pushed this women's agenda. Yeah, I would have probably went to it. I would have probably 35. They pushed this woman's agenda shit, and I just wasn't with it. I didn't like Ronda Rousey. I felt like she was a fraud in MMA, and she was a fraud in wrestling. She was the type of person that was a prima donna. She cries when she don't get her way. She thinks she should be handed to her. She thought it'd be a cakewalk going into fake wrestling. She couldn't be humiliated like she was against Holly Holm or Amanda Nunes. In wrestling, she when the fans didn't take to her and they booed her out of the arena at Survivor Series 2018. She bitched and moaned. She dissed wrestling. They let her back in. She bitched again that she wasn't in the main event at WrestleMania 33. But bitch, Stone Cold Steve Austin was coming back after 19 years. You know what I mean? Did you actually think that you and Charlotte Flair was going to main event over Stone Cold Steve Austin's in-ring return? Come on, really? Like, Ronda Rousey would piss me off if I knew her because she's the type of person that throws a temper tantrum when she doesn't get her way. Sasha Banks is too. That's why she didn't work out uh, with WWE. But Ronda thought wrestling would be a cakewalk because it's fake and she can't lose and be humiliated like she was in MMA. But she was humiliated in a different way. She was a horrible promo. She was mediocre in the ring. Girls bust their ass. Yeah, Ronda Rousey is a loser. Girls bust their ass to get her over. Girls like Alexa Bliss literally bust their ass, breaking bones to get that bitch over. And she has the nerve to go on podcast and say that the business is fake and she had fun playing around with it. Now, I know kayfabe is over and everything, but come on. And you weren't doing it for an angle to turn heel because you left the business and didn't come back for 2 years. So what was the point of doing that? You just wanted to bury all the women that made you look good. You know? So, yeah, the ladder match, honestly, Brian, I didn't, I didn't have a lot of high expectations for it because you got to understand at that time, going in, I didn't have high expectations. When I left, I thought that was the greatest match I ever saw. You know what I mean? Like that match changed wrestling because like I tried to explain to David, he was born in 91. We did a video together, WrestleMania 10. David was there. And I tried to explain to him back then in 1994, we didn't see moonsaults. We didn't see moves off the top rope. We didn't see ladders. Wrestling was pretty fundamentally ground based, or kicks and punches in 1994. Things like lucha libre didn't come on the scene in American wrestling yet. And I'm Hispanic, but I don't speak it and I never watched lucha libre. I was exposed to it the same way that other American kids were exposed to it. So I never saw anything like that. So that completely blew me away, that match. But going into it, I didn't expect much because I didn't know what a ladder match was supposed to be like. But it completely changed the business. It was phenomenal. And I was a huge Razor Ramon mark, so I love seeing him win. I actually was fooled. I thought Razor Ramon was Latino. And, it was cool seeing another Latino be so high up on the card like that. He wasn't, but I thought he was. I didn't see him in WCWs. And I like Shawn Michaels. I always did, even when he was in the Rockers. So it was an awesome match. And Owen and Brett was great. Owen and Brett was tremendous. Owen and Brett to this day is the best opener in any wrestling show. I was one of the few rooting for Owen Hart because I was the baby brother in my own family. So being the baby in my family, you know how it feels to get overshadowed by an older sibling. Where, yeah, Yoko and Brett. Yoko Yoko only had good chemistry with Taker. Anybody else, he he bombed. Like they praised Yoko and stuff. And he was good for a big guy, but unless he was working with Taker, he was phoning it in every single time. And then the ending was stupid because it made it look like if you saw it in person, it made it look like Roddy Piper shook the ropes and Yoko fell down. So it kind of makes Hart look like a heel, like he had to cheat to win. And then the Luger ending, like Luger was an inflated balloon. Once Luger didn't win against Yoko at SummerSlam '93, that was the end of him. But they had done a storyline at WrestleMania 9 where they were doing a breakfast. Yeah. They were doing a breakfast, a charity breakfast, and Lex Luger had knocked out Bret Hart. So I thought they could pick up the storyline of Luger and Hart and do a babyface match at the end. That would have made more sense to me, and that would have probably been a better match. You know what I mean? Lex Luger and Bret Hart babyface match. Have Luger go over because you had two title defenses that night. He wrestled Yoko first, and then he wrestled Bret second. And you could have had Luger and Bret Hart. Yeah, but they didn't do that then. That didn't exist yet. They didn't have the first triple threat match until the latter part of 1994. In anywhere in wrestling, ECW did it first. ECW did Shane Douglas, Sabu, and Terry Funk was the first um, triple threat match, but the main two promotions didn't do that yet. Yeah, but I agree. They would have made history by doing it, being the first to do it. The way they did it was really convoluted. They had to do a coin toss, and then faces. Uh, Luger had to face Yoko first, and then Bret had to face Owen. Like, and if Luger won, he had to face Crush. Yeah, yeah. But the way it ended was cool because Owen was like, okay, he finally got his win over Bret. He's finally out of Bret's shadow, but then he's not because his win is overshadowed by Bret. Yeah, he beat Bret, but Bret went on later in the night to win the WWF Championship. It was a cool story, and the way they did it, and Owen and Bret went on to have a phenomenal year in '94. Their cage match at SummerSlam was great too. The first cage match in history to never have any blood, but still be a compelling story. But where they made the mistake was they should have put the belt on Owen at Survivor Series '94 instead of Backlund. I didn't understand that. You know what I mean? Like they did a towel match at Survivor Series where Owen was in Backlund's corner and British Bulldog was in Bret's corner, and each guy had to throw the towel in. Obviously, an allusion to when Backlund lost the championship the last time, when his manager Scullin threw in the towel. But still, why do that? Like, just have Owen go over. Yeah, you know. Owen's been chasing the whole year. Owen Hart was the top heel of 1994 in both companies. I really wasn't watching ECW, so I can't say. But as far as in WWF and WCW, when it came to 1994, Owen Hart was the top heel in all of wrestling. There was nobody hotter because Ric Flair was lukewarm. Fans were still cheering Ric Flair when he turned heel in '94 in WCW. You know, yeah, but yeah, the Backlund win didn't make any sense. You're just gonna have him drop it to Diesel anyway. I mean, yes, Backlund was an over heel. Don't get me wrong, Brian, because I remember being in school that time, and every kid was trying to put other kids in the crossface chicken wing. You know, on the playground, the move was over, but Backlund himself wasn't really that over. The move was over because it looked like it hurt. You know what I mean? When you would see wrestlers, especially Brett, the way he would sell it, you know what I mean? Like, he's a crossface chicken wing, it look like he's killing them, right? That's what made the ending of Survivor Series 94 so compelling. But the commentary was shit in Survivor Series that year because you had Vince McMahon and Gorilla Monsoon, two babyface announcers. You didn't have a heel announcer to really explain it from a heel's point of view. That's what makes a heel announcer so compelling. Like the Jerry the King Lawler in the Attitude Era, or Bobby Heenan, or Jesse Ventura, to explain the heel's point of view, to tell it from the heel side. You know what I mean? And that's what's missing in today's wrestling. You don't have real heel announcers in today's wrestling. You have Pat McAfee, who's a babyface, who marks out for every little thing a babyface does, and who screams like a moron. Like look at the way he screamed at WrestleMania 41 when Heyman turned. Like he was almost uh, you couldn't even understand what he was saying, Heyman has turned on his tribal chief. If it was Heenan or Lawler or Ventura, right? They would have been like, they would have been explaining it from Heyman's point of view. Of course, Heyman turned on Punk. Punk uh, left Heyman in WWE for 10 years, right? And didn't even contact him, didn't even call him when Heyman was sick or something, right? And Roman, he just used Heyman, to get back on top. Explain it from Heyman's point of view. Make us understand. No. Yeah. I saw him only on TV. I think he was at WrestleMania 10, but I didn't see him. Vlad the Superfan. We always see him. Now, Green Shirt Guy is the new Vlad. Green Shirt Guy is the new Vlad. You're seeing, and you're wondering, just like you wondered with Vlad, where does he now, especially with the ticket hikes, you're wondering, where does Green Shirt Guy get all the money that he's able to go to all these shows? But yeah, Vlad, man, oh man, I used to see him on TV. He was even in Wembley Stadium. Like he even flew out to England to be. He even flew out to England to be. Uh, yeah, as a kid, that would have been my man. I would have loved that from both a wrestling point of view and as a geography and history nerd point of view. From both points of view, a wrestling nerd and a history nerd, loving that from both points of view, because not only do I get to see all these great matches and live all these great moments in person, but I'm going to all these great cities. I tell people all the time, I learned geography. It wasn't school that made me master geography. It was watching professional wrestling that made me master geography. Because every week they were in a different city and the announcers would always announce the city. We're in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We're in Biloxi, Mississippi. We're in Calgary, Alberta. We're in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. We're here, we're there. And me as a New Yorker living in Brooklyn, New York, never really going anywhere outside of the Northeast, I would have never even known, had it not been for wrestling, that Calgary, Alberta exists, that Saskatoon, Saskatchewan exists, that Biloxi, Mississippi, Chattanooga, Tennessee, never known about these places. Had it not been for professional wrestling. So seeing it on TV was uh, exhilarating. Could you imagine going there like Vlad? You know what I mean? And experiencing both the city and the event itself. That's crazy, man. I would have loved that. you know? Did you ever watch the documentary on him and Peacock? You know, but when Vlad stopped going, that's when wrestling started sucking. If Vlad, the super fan that he is, stops caring, that's how you know it's going down the drain. Because this guy lived wrestling, and he no longer cares. Green shirt guy, I think green shirt guy is employed by the company. You can't really count him as a fan. You know what I mean? Like he's not like Vlad. He's employed by WWE. You know, same thing with the guy with the Trinidadian flag all the time, the red and white flag. I think that guy knows somebody uh, in the company. Same thing. Yeah, because he was so enthusiastic, and it was cool for me because he was a grown man. It flew in the face of the logic that these haters, these wrestling haters, and there were a lot of them in my family that would tell me, "Oh, that's just kid stuff. You'll eventually outgrow it." But here you got this grown guy excited about this wrestling, and it made me feel like as I got older, like I shouldn't be ashamed for liking this stuff. You know, because in the mainstream media they make fun of us that are older and like wrestling. I mean, look at the joke in Waterboy when he calls Big Show up, you know, and Big Show playing the part of Captain Insano. They make fun of him. They say that he's a virgin. They say that he's a loser, a geek. You know what I mean? Mhm. I know it's played for laughs. I'm not trying to be like a snowflake SJW getting offended at everything, but you know, uh, just the point of just the point of you know how they've always like wrestling, despite the booms that it's had. It's had four booms in its history since being on television: the late '40s and early '50s, um, from 1982 to 1992, which is the golden era, the Attitude Era from '96 to 2001, and now this boom from 2020 to who knows when. But um, despite that, you can have a million. So this is what Vince McMahon never got, and I don't think TKO understands this either. You could have a million celebrities there. You could have the president of the United States, Donald Trump, walk out tomorrow and endorse professional wrestling. But in the end of the day, no matter how many celebrities you have there, no matter how many uh, famous people profess to love wrestling, no matter how many arenas you packed, in the end of the day, to the mainstream media, it's still going to be wrestling. And people are still going to look down on it. People are still going to laugh at it. You know what I mean? And that's sad, but that's just the reality of it. It's still, it's always going to be looked down upon no matter what. And if you're going to love it as an adult, especially, you have to come to terms with that. You have to come to terms with that. This is the way it is. This is why people look down on it. And you have to come to terms with this is why I made a YouTube channel. My YouTube channel ended up expanding to other topics. I have politics on here, I have other things, but initially music and stuff. But initially I made this YouTube channel so I could talk about wrestling with other wrestling fans that were just enthusiastic about it as I was, that loved it like I loved it. Because you can't do that in the mainstream because most people don't like it. And then those that do hide it for whatever reason. You know what I mean? Because the way that it's looked down upon. And it always will be that way. You know what I'm saying? Uh, no matter if Travis Scott walks out, no matter who, it's wrestling, and wrestling, well, the people will always look down on it. because it's a work, it's choreographed, and not only because of that, because of the stereotypes associated with it. The fact that they look down upon it because it's a work is stupid. Because by that logic, you shouldn't ever watch movies. You should never watch anything other than documentaries. Which even documentaries in the news can be heavily manipulated. It may not be fake, but it's manipulated. It's set in a certain way that makes you have an opinion that you have, depending on the channel you watch. Look at MSNBC with liberals. Look at Fox News with conservatives. That's news, but that's entertainment news at the same time. Like you're watching that to get your views confirmed. It's like when you go to church. You don't go to church. You don't go to a Catholic church to hear about how Islam is great or how Judaism is great. You go to hear about how Catholicism is great. It confirms what you already believe. So that might be real, but that's manipulated in a certain way. Anyway, Brian and David, good night. Yeah, I met Bruce Pritchard. Uh, I met him in 2017. He was in New York at the Gramercy Theater. It was SummerSlam weekend that year because that's when they were doing SummerSlam in Brooklyn. It was the main event was I went to there, and after that I went to SummerSlam. The main event was Braun Strowman, Brock Lesnar, Roman, and Samoa Joe. But yeah, I met Bruce Pritchard. I got meet and greet with him and everything. And his live shows were all right. He had a special guest each city, and his special guest for the New York show that I went to was Brian Gewirtz. That's when they were really praying for Flair, because Flair was, I don't know if you noticed, Brian, but Ric Flair was almost dead in 2017. Flair is lucky to be alive. He was like in a coma for like several days. And of course, Conrad is his son-in-law, so. But yeah, I discovered Bruce Pritchard in 2016, like around the time when he started. Originally, when he started, the show was really entertaining. The show was funny. But after a while, especially when he went back to WWE in 2018, he just became a shill for WWE. I mean, he was already a shill for Vince McMahon, but like he stopped doing real shows. They started doing these mega episodes, and now they jumped the shark. They have a JBL doing the show now, and I didn't even find JBL entertaining as a wrestler, let alone a commentator. And what booking meetings was he in on? What was the point of Bruce's podcast was the closest we would ever get to hearing Vince McMahon, because he was Vince McMahon's right-hand man from 87 to 2008. So like he was like, and he was around for a lot of backstage stuff. That was his slogan. I was there. Conrad would read Dave Meltzer's commentary, and Bruce would just shoot it down. That was the fun of the show. But JBL wasn't there for anything. He was never involved with creative at all. He was just a wrestler. 83 weeks had 83 weeks had a rough start. Honestly, 83 weeks was boring at first because Bischoff either said he didn't remember or tried to just lie and bullshit his way into shit. And then he started like really picking on Meltzer, because like he knew that worked for Bruce, and he started to like throw Meltzer under the bus. But the most boringest one in the beginning anyway was Tony Schiavone. It was like Tony Schiavone didn't know shit. You know what I mean? Like when you even there, Tony, like you know, it. Kevin Nash, I like him as a wrestler, but Click This is one of the most boringest podcasts that you can imagine, Brian. I don't know if you've listened to it, but Click This is so boring. Like you would think Kevin Nash would be a little bit more entertaining, but he just he puts you to sleep, and then he talks about shit that isn't wrestling. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I like politics, I like social issues, and my channel is kind of a mix of everything. But if I'm talking about that, if I'm listening to a wrestler's podcast, I have no interest in hearing about Kevin Nash's opinion on Gaza, or Kevin Nash's opinion on Donald Trump, or Kevin Nash's opinion on the stock market, or his opinion on H-1B visas. No, I don't. You know, like, you know, like, no, like, why would I listen to Kevin Nash for that? Like, yeah, thank you, Brian. But yeah, man, like the podcast, the podcast scene is overrun now. It's oversaturated. When Bruce started it, he was the pioneer because he was the first guy to the way podcasts used to be before Bruce Pritchard was when they would bring a guest on each and every week, and they would interview that guest, and the guest would, bullshit or whatever. But Pritchard, it was like picking his brain, and that was cool. And then every wrestler started to do that now, and some are just not equipped for that. You know what I mean? Like Ted DiBiase is boring. Hacksaw Jim Duggan is boring. You know what I mean? Like Kevin Nash is all over the place. Jim Ross, you know what I mean? Like Jim Ross and Tony Schiavone, they just shill for AEW. you know, once once these guys like Bruce Pritchard and Tony Schiavone and and Jim Ross started working for the two major companies again, it just became them shilling for those companies. And I really stopped caring. Now I listen to a lot more fan podcasts, fan perspectives. You know what I mean? One that is good is the Laps Fan. The Laps Fan, uh, Brian, I don't know if you've heard of them. JP Soros and Jack Encarnacion. Uh, they're pretty funny. They have me laughing out loud, and they're not wrestlers. They weren't wrestlers, but the Labs Fan is a creative because they're from our era. You know what I mean? 80s and 90s, and they kind of fell away. They're lapsed. So it's like the Labs Fan, LASPED. Like a lapsed Catholic. Theirs is pretty good. Another one is OSW Review. They're guys from Ireland. They're guys from Ireland, and they review classic pay-per-views. Um, Fans' perspective, because I'm no longer interested in industry perspectives anymore, like Bruce or them, because they just bullshit. You know what I mean? Like, of course, I got into the shoot interview circuit first. You know what I mean? Because as wrestling fans, we always crave information. I think our pastime is different than other pastimes because we always want to know things. You know what I mean? Like the NBA They're not looking for a podcast of Michael Jordan. You know what I mean? They're not looking for a podcast of Charles Barkley or Magic Johnson. They don't want to know the behind the scenes. They don't care about it. Even MMA fans really don't care about it, but wrestling fans do because it was hidden from us for so long through the wall of kayfabe. I was the type as a kid to if I could get away with it, I got in trouble a lot. But to call Mean Gene's hotline, and then when I discovered uh, Wrestling Observer, I got into that, and then and then and then you know shoot interviews came out. RFW, I mean RF video, but those kind of shoot interviews were kind of boring because again, not every wrestler is a good conversationalist. Like sometimes Rob Feinstein would ask a question, and a wrestler would be like, uh, well, what was it like to work with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, right? And they would just be like, "Oh, it was good," and like a one word answer, like we're paying for this shoot interview, we want to hear more, like you know, you know, like, and then kayfabe commentary, Sean Oliver, he came out with some pretty good concepts because he would do year in review, he would do uh, was one of his best, but it's behind a, it's one of the ones he puts behind a paywall is with Piper, the 84, 85 year interview. Piper on there basically almost confessed that he was sexually assaulted by Pat Patterson in the 70s. You know what I mean? So like uh they did some interesting stuff. The books, I never believed those because once WWE got in on the book game, like Mick Foley's first book was awesome. Like he changed the game because like he came to my school in 2003, my senior year, and he talked about how when he put the book out, his first book, a lot of people said, you know, uh, who's it gonna sell to? Wrestling fans don't read. you know, you like, and he proved them wrong. But then when WWE got in on it and everybody and their mama had a book, Hulk Hogan had his bullshit book in 2002, and it was like, okay, now they've got in on it, so it ruined it. Just like when the podcast came, like Vince McMahon said to Austin at the night after Royal Rumble '98, "You ruined it. You ruined it. You ruined it." So yeah, he did. Hulk Hogan did get. He's a born again Christian now because he's with his wife Sky. But people don't like Hogan because they don't know what to believe, David. He never stops working. You work when you're in the ring. You don't when you're outside of the ring. It's not called working, Hulk. It's called lying. you know, you know. He just today he said, "Oh man, I worked with Brock Lesnar right after he got out of the UFC." Oh yeah, I remember that match, Hogan. Extreme Rules 2012. Nope, that was Cena. Sorry, that didn't happen. You worked with him in 2002 before he came into the UFC. Like all you had with him was a confrontation in your birthday celebration on Raw in 2014. Like he says things that he thinks that we can't check with verification, like that he was almost a bass player for Metallica, or that or that he was the original choice over Mickey Rourke for the wrestler. But meantime, it was always going to be Mickey, and not only was it always going to be Mickey, that it was um when they thought Mickey Rourke wouldn't be available, the next choice was Nicolas Cage. It was never Hogan. Darren Aronofsky wouldn't do that because it was a serious movie and Hogan is a shitty actor. You know, so, Anyway, guys, I'm out of here. See you guys tomorrow. Thank you, Brian, for contributing. Definitely look to subscribe, Brian. Thank you, David, for always joining us. It was fun. 3 hour live stream. Peace.